The rough hemp cloth scraped against his skin, abrasive and demanding, held in the hands of a trembling servant who did not dare to look up. Water, cold and shocking against the humid air of the Japanese interior, cascaded down his broad chest, pooling on the polished wooden floorboards of the temple. It was a humiliation, yet it was also a test, and the man standing in the center of the room did not flinch. He stood like a mountain carved from obsidian, his breath steady, his eyes fixed on the figure seated on the raised dais before him. The seated man was Oda Nobunaga, the most feared warlord in the history of this archipelago, a man who burned temples and reshaped empires with a wave of his iron fan. Nobunaga leaned forward, his eyes wide, burning with a mixture of suspicion and fascination. He believed the skin before him was a trick of ink or soot, a deception painted upon a foreign body to frighten or impress. He had ordered the scrubbing. He wanted to see the truth beneath the surface. As the servant scrubbed harder, urged on by the warlord's impatient gesture, the skin did not pale. It glistened. The water washed away dust and sweat, but the deep, rich darkness of the man's complexion only shone with greater intensity, like wet stone on a riverbed. The silence in the room was heavy, thick with the scent of cedar and burning incense. The scrubbing stopped. The servant pulled back, bowing so low his forehead touched the wet floor. The black man remained standing, towering over everyone present, a giant in a land of smaller stature. He was over 6 feet tall, a physical anomaly in 16th century Japan, with shoulders that spoke of a lifetime of carrying burdens that would crush lesser men. Nobunaga stood up. The tension in the room snapped. The warlord did not draw his sword. Instead, a smile broke across his face, a rare, dangerous expression of genuine delight. He laughed, not in mockery, but in the sheer ecstasy of discovery. The ink was not ink. The man was real. This moment, this singular intersection of water, skin, and power, was the pivot point of a destiny that had begun thousands of miles away, across oceans that swallowed horizons and erased names. Before he was the samurai, before he was the curiosity of Kyoto, he was a son of the vast red earth of Africa. To understand the giant standing in the damp temple hall, one must look back to the ocean that carried him there. The journey had not begun in the delicate misty valleys of Japan, but in the heat of the Mozambican coast, or perhaps further inland, among the tall, proud people of the Dinka or the Makua. History has allowed the specifics of his birth to drift into the fog, but the man himself carried the memories in the marrow of his bones. He remembered the rhythm of the drums that sounded nothing like the sharp clack of wooden clappers in Kyoto. He remembered a sun that did not hide behind grey clouds but burned with an unyielding golden ferocity. He had been swept up into the great grinding machinery of the Portuguese expansion, a world of caravels and trade winds, of Jesuits and spices. He had become a servant, a protector, a shadow cast long against the sails of the great ships. He was given a Christian name, perhaps, or a slave name, but those labels were temporary, shifting like the tides. What remained constant was his strength. It was his currency. In a world where survival was a daily negotiation, his physical power was the one truth everyone understood. He had travelled with Alessandro Valignano, the visitor of the Jesuit missions, a man of high status and holy orders who needed protection as he traversed the dangerous, pirate-infested waters of the Indies. Yasuke was the wall between the priest and the chaotic world. He learned the language of the ship, the creak of timber, the slap of the canvas, the polyglot curses of sailors from Lisbon, Goa, and Malacca. He learned to stand balanced on a heaving deck, while the horizon tilted violently, a skill that gave him a grace of movement that belied his size. When the ship finally pierced the mist surrounding the islands of Japan in 1579, the air tasted different. It tasted of pine and iron. This was a country at war with itself, the Sengoku Jidai, an era where brothers killed brothers, and the soil was perpetually thirsty for blood. The Jesuits were tolerated, sometimes welcomed, sometimes reviled, but they were always watched, and the man who walked behind Valignano was watched most of all. As they moved inland, the reaction was not merely curiosity. It was a form of hysteria. In the villages, work stopped. Farmers dropped their hoes in the mud. Mothers covered the eyes of their children, or held them up to see the great black temple guardian who walked among them. They had never seen a man with skin the color of midnight, nor a man who stood a full head and shoulders above the tallest samurai. The journey to Kyoto, the imperial capital, was a slow procession of shock. But it was in the capital itself, in the year 1581, that the presence of this man sparked a firestorm. The Jesuits had established a church, the Nabandera, a small island of foreign faith in the heart of the ancient city. When rumors spread that the Black Giant was staying there, the discipline of the city collapsed. The streets, usually ordered by the strict social hierarchies of the time, became a churning river of humanity. People climbed the wooden roofs of neighboring buildings, disregarding the tiles that cracked under their weight. They pressed against the gates of the Jesuit residence, a crushing tide of bodies desperate for a single glimpse. The air was filled with shouting, the heat of thousands of bodies pressing together, the dust rising to choke the sky. Inside the compound, the Jesuits were terrified. They feared the mob would tear the doors down, that the structure itself would buckle. The stones of the walls groaned under the pressure. People were being crushed, trampled in the frenzy. It was a riot born not of anger, but of an overwhelming, consuming need to witness the impossible. Yasuke stood in the center of this chaos, likely bewildered by the sheer scale of the reaction. He was used to stares, used to being the other, but this was different. This was a hunger. To the people of Kyoto, he was not just a foreigner, he was a mythological figure made flesh, a demon or a deity, something that defied the natural order of their closed world. It was the noise of this riot that reached the ears of Oda Nobunaga. The warlord's fortress was a place of absolute control, a sharp contrast to the chaotic streets. When the report came of a disturbance at the Jesuit church, caused by a man black as ink and tall as a pine, Nobunaga did not send soldiers to disperse the crowd. He sent a summons. He demanded to see the cause of the madness. This led to the scrubbing, the water, and the laughter. When the realization settled that Yasuke's skin was natural, Nobunaga's demeanor shifted from suspicion to intense predatory interest. He was a man who collected rare tea bowls, exotic tiger skins, and European clocks. He valued the unique, the strong, and the functional. In Yasuke, he saw all three. The warlord circled him, measuring the width of his chest, the thickness of his arms. The chronicles of Lord Nobunaga, the Shincho Koki, would later record that this man had the strength of 10 men. It was an assessment made not just by sight, but by the aura of capability that radiated from him. Nobunaga, a man who survived assassination attempts and betrayals as a matter of routine, had an instinct for violence. He knew a warrior when he saw one, regardless of the uniform. But it was what happened after the physical inspection that truly sealed Yasuke's fate. Nobunaga began to speak. The warlord was known for his sharp tongue, his quick temper, and his impatience with dullards. He expected Yasuke to be a mute beast, a statue to be admired. Instead, Yasuke answered. Over the years of travel with the Jesuits, interacting with Japanese converts and translators, Yasuke had absorbed the language. It may have been accented, rough around the edges, but it was functional. He could speak. He could understand. Nobunaga was captivated. He sat on the tatami mats, gesturing for Yasuke to sit not on the floor like a servant, but closer, within the inner circle of conversation. They spoke of the world outside Japan. Nobunaga, who dreamed of unifying Japan and perhaps conquering beyond it, was hungry for knowledge of the shape of the earth. He asked about the great oceans, the dark continent of Africa, the architecture of European cathedrals, the animals that roamed the plains of Yasuke's memory. For the first time in a long time, Yasuke was not just a body, he was a mind. He was a window into a universe Nobunaga could only imagine. The warlord never tired of talking to him. In the rigid, suffocating hierarchy of the Japanese court, where every word was measured and every interaction scripted by protocol, Yasuke was a breath of fresh air. He was outside the system, and therefore he could be trusted in a way the scheming daimyos could not. The transition was rapid, almost dizzying. Valignano, the Jesuit visitor, realized that he could not refuse the warlord's desire. To deny Nobunaga was to invite destruction, and so the transaction was made. Yasuke was released from the service of the church and entered the service of the dragon. The transformation began with the clothes. The rough travelling tunics of the Jesuit servant were discarded. In their place came the silk and hemp of the Japanese warrior. The fabric was light but strong. Dyed in deep indigos and slate greys, he was given a formal residence, a house of his own in the shadow of Azuchi Castle, Nobunaga's magnificent, towering headquarters on the shores of Lake Biwa. Then came the symbols of status. He was granted a stipend, an income that elevated him above the common peasantry and the foot soldiers. He was given a servant of his own, a reversal of roles that must have felt surreal to a man who had spent his life serving others. But the most profound moment was the presentation of the sword. In the culture of the samurai, the katana was not merely a weapon, it was the soul of the warrior. It was a sacred object, forged in fire and prayer, capable of cutting through bone and steel. Peasants were forbidden to carry them. Foreigners were forbidden to touch them. Nobunaga presented Yasuke with a sayamaki, a ceremonial sword, and likely a functional battle sword to accompany it. When Yasuke wrapped his large fingers around the suka, the hilt, he was no longer a visitor. He was a retainer. He was a kosho, a high-ranking page and bodyguard. He was the sword-bearer for the most powerful man in the realm. The name Yasuke itself was a gift. It is likely a Japanese phonetic adaptation of his original name, perhaps Yasufe or Isaac, but in receiving it from Nobunaga, it became a title of legitimacy. He was written into the ledger of the clan. Life in Azuchi Castle was a world of breathtaking beauty and underlying menace. The castle was a labyrinth of gold-leafed walls, painted screens depicting tigers and dragons, and sliding doors that whispered when they opened. Yasuke walked these halls, his footsteps heavy but controlled. He stood guard outside Nobunaga's chambers, a towering sentinel of black iron against the delicate paper walls. The other samurai, initially shocked, grew to respect the sheer physical reality of him. In the dojo, the training hall, the strength of 10 men was not a metaphor. When he practiced with the wooden bokken, the impact was like a falling tree. He learned the techniques of Japanese swordsmanship, the focus on the center line, the explosion of energy from the hips, the stillness before the strike. He combined these disciplined movements with his own natural reach and power, creating a style that was terrifying to behold. He was often seen riding alongside Nobunaga. The warlord was an expert horseman, and he ensured Yasuke was mounted on a steed strong enough to bear him. Together they made a striking picture. The slender, wiry warlord with his intense, hawkish gaze, and the massive armored giant at his side. They rode through the countryside, and the people bowed, their faces pressed to the dirt, fear and awe mingling in the dust. But it was not just about war. It was about intimacy. Nobunaga was a man of deep loneliness. His genius isolated him. His cruelty isolated him. He was surrounded by vassals who feared him, family members who plotted against him, and enemies who wanted his head. In Yasuke, he found a strange form of purity. Yasuke had no political ambition in Japan. He had no clan loyalties to juggle, no hidden agenda to seize territory. His loyalty was simple, direct, and absolute. It was the loyalty of a man who had been given dignity for the first time. Nobunaga invited Yasuke to dine at his own table, a breach of protocol that scandalized the conservative retainers. They ate rice, fish, and pickled vegetables, the warlord asking endless questions, the samurai answering with stories of the savannah, of elephants, of the vast, star-filled skies of the southern hemisphere. During these months, Yasuke absorbed the code of Bushido, the way of the warrior. He learned that death was lighter than a feather, but duty was heavier than a mountain. He understood that his life now belonged to the man who had given him a sword. The concept of honor debt of gratitude that can never be fully repaid took root in his heart. Nobunaga had not just given him a job, he had given him an identity. He had looked at a Moorish infidel and seen a samurai. The winter of 1581 turned to the spring of 1582. The cherry blossoms bloomed in a riot of pink and white, drifting down onto the dark waters of Lake Biwa. It was a time of apparent triumph. The Oda clan was crushing its enemies. The unification of Japan seemed inevitable. The Takeda clan had been destroyed. The Mori were being pressed back. Nobunaga's vision of a new world was taking shape. A world where commerce flourished, where guns replaced arrows, and where ability mattered more than lineage. Yasuke stood at the pinnacle of this new world. He was a sensation, a trusted confidant, a warrior who had found a home at the edge of the known earth. He walked through the castle towns, his two swords tucked into his obi sash, the crest of the Oda clan perhaps displayed on his armor. He had respect. He had purpose. But the Sengoku period was a time of treacherous currents. Just as the ocean can turn from calm to violent with the shifting of the wind, so too could the political landscape of Japan. Beneath the surface of Nobunaga's absolute power, resentment was boiling. There were whispers in the dark corners of the tea-houses. There were glances exchanged between generals who felt slighted by the warlord's arrogance. Yasuke, for all his strength, could not see the invisible daggers being sharpened in the shadows. He saw only the man who had elevated him, the lord who had laughed with delight when the water ran clear over his skin. He prepared for battles on the field, for the clash of armies he could see and strike. He did not know that the true threat would come, not from a distant enemy, but from within the inner circle itself. The air grew humid as summer approached. The cicadas began their rhythmic, deafening buzzing, a sound that drilled into the mind. Nobunaga decided to travel to Kyoto, to stay at the Honnoji Temple, a place of peace and prayer, to prepare for a campaign in the west. He took only a small retinue with him. He felt secure. He felt invincible. Yasuke rode with him. The horses' hooves clattered on the stones of the highway leading to the capital. The mountains loomed green and lush on either side. Yasuke looked at the back of his master, the man who had rewritten his destiny. He adjusted the sword at his hip. He was ready to die for this man. He did not know that the test of that resolve was rushing toward them, marching under the banner of a blue bellflower, carried by a general named Akechi Mitsuhide. The ocean was far behind him now. The stone had been cast, and the ripples were about to become a tidal wave. The road to the capital was a ribbon of beaten earth winding through the verdant heart of the June summer. The air was thick, heavy with moisture that clung to the skin and turned the distant mountain peaks into soft grey silhouettes against a pale sky. It was the rainy season, a time when the world seemed to hold its breath between downpours, the humidity amplifying the scent of wet pine, churned mud, and the leather of the saddles. Yasuke rode with a posture that had transformed over the last year. Gone was the slight hesitation of a stranger in a strange land. In its place sat the upright, fluid grace of a man who had found his center. He moved in rhythm with his horse, his body absorbing the sway, his eyes scanning the tree lines, not with fear, but with the practiced vigilance of a guardian. He wore the attire of his station, the fabrics dark and rich, tailored to accommodate his immense frame. The ceremonial sword, the sayamaki, rested against his hip, a constant, tangible reminder of the trust placed in him. To the villagers and farmers who bowed low in the rice paddies as the procession passed, he was a figure of mythical proportions, a towering silhouette of obsidian and iron, riding in the shadow of the dragon of the Wari. But to Oda Nobunaga, riding just ahead, he was simply Yasuke. He was the listener, the warrior, the man whose strength was equaled only by his loyalty. The journey was relatively quiet. Nobunaga had brought only a small retinue, a few dozen attendants and merchants, confident in his dominion over the central provinces. He felt the security of a man who believes he has tamed the storm. They spoke little as they rode, the rhythmic clatter of hooves on stone filling the silence, a hypnotic percussion that lulled the mind into a trance. Yasuke watched the back of his lord's head. the way the humid breeze tugged at his topknot. He thought of the journey that had brought him here, from the sweltering coasts of Mozambique, across the endless rolling blue of the Indian Ocean, through the chaotic ports of India, to this misty, mountainous island. It felt as though he had lived 3 lifetimes. The first was a memory of red earth and vast skies. The second was a blur of ships and servitude under the Jesuits. And this, the third, was a life of steel and honor. They arrived in Kyoto as the afternoon light began to deepen into the gold of early evening. The capital was different now than it had been upon his first arrival. Then his presence had nearly incited a riot, the crushing weight of curious bodies threatening to collapse the buildings. Now a hush fell over the streets as they passed. The people still stared, their eyes wide with the same mixture of awe and disbelief, but they kept their distance. The crest of the Oda clan commanded a fearful respect, and the black giant who rode within its inner circle was no longer a curiosity to be gawked at, but a lord to be feared. Yasuke looked over the tiled rooftops of Kyoto, the city of temples and intrigue, feeling a strange sense of ownership. He was no longer an observer. He was a part of this city's breathing history. The destination was Homoji, a temple nestled in the heart of the city. It was a fortified compound, walled and secure, yet it retained the serene architecture of a place of worship. As they passed through the heavy wooden gates, the noise of the capital faded, replaced by the crunch of gravel and the gentle rustle of bamboo in the temple gardens. The air here was cooler, scented with sandalwood incense and old timber. Servants moved with silent efficiency, taking the horses, lighting lanterns as the twilight began to bleed the color from the world. Nobunaga retired to his quarters, a spacious set of rooms deep within the temple complex. He was in high spirits, his mind already turning toward the campaign in the west, toward the final unification of the realm. He spoke to Yasuke of tea, of the intricate bowls and the philosophy of the poor, his voice carrying that familiar, sharp enthusiasm. Yasuke listened, kneeling in the corner of the room, his presence merging with the shadows. He did not need to speak often. His role was to be the solid earth beneath the mercurial sky of Nobunaga's ambition. Night fell completely. It was June 21st, 1582. The sky was overcast, blotting out the stars, leaving the temple grounds wrapped in a heavy, velvet darkness. The only light came from the stone lanterns lining the paths and the warm glow emanating from the paper screens of the main hall. A profound silence settled over Honoji. It was the silence of a deep sleep, the kind of stillness that feels eternal. The cicadas had ceased their buzzing, leaving only the occasional croak of a frog from the decorative pond or the distant, muffled bark of a dog in the city streets. Yasuke sat watch. Sleep was a luxury he took in small, measured doses. He sat with his back straight, his breathing slow and deep, his senses extended outward. He felt the humidity pressing against the sliding doors. He heard the soft footsteps of the pages moving through the corridors. He felt safe. They all did. They were in the center of their power, surrounded by allies. The most powerful armies in Japan were under the command of Nobunaga's generals Hideyoshi fighting in the west, Ieyasu touring the Kansai region, and Takeshi Mitsuhide, the scholar-warrior, marching to support the campaign. There was no reason to look over one shoulder when the only people behind you were your brothers in arms. But the darkness outside the walls was not empty. While Honoji slept, the roads leading to Kyoto were trembling under the weight of 13,000 men. They moved without torches, a river of iron flowing through the night. The soldiers marched with discipline, their armor bound with cloth to muffle the sound of the plates clinking together. Above them, unseen in the gloom, fluttered the banners of the bluebell flower. The men did not know their true target. They had been told they were marching for a review, or perhaps to crush a minor rebellion. Only the commanders knew the truth. Only Takeshi Mitsuhide, riding at the head of the column, knew that he was about to set the world on fire. Yasuke shifted his weight, the floorboards creaking softly beneath him. A strange unease began to prickle at the back of his neck. It was an instinct honed in the wild, a primal sense that the air pressure had changed. He looked toward the sliding doors. The night seemed too quiet. The usual sounds of the city, the distant hum of life that never truly stopped in Kyoto, seemed to have been smothered. Then, just before dawn, the silence broke. It did not begin with a roar, but with a series of sharp, confused sounds. A shout from the outer gate, the heavy thud of wood splintering, the distinct, chilling ring of steel being drawn from a scabbard. Yasuke was on his feet in a heartbeat, his hand already gripping the hilt of his sword. The movement was instinctive, faster than thought. From the inner chambers, Nobunaga's voice cut through the stillness. "What is that noise? Is it a brawl among the servants?" Yasuke slid the door open, stepping out onto the wooden veranda. The cool air of the pre-dawn hit his face, but it carried a scent that froze his blood. It was not the smell of rain. It was the smell of burning oil and sweat. Down in the courtyard, shadows were moving. Too many shadows. They spilled over the walls like dark water, flowing around the stone lanterns. He saw the glint of spear tips catching the faint light. He saw the crest on the flags, the blue bell flower of the Akechi clan. "It is not a brawl, my lord," Yasuke said, his voice deep and steady, though his heart hammered against his ribs. He turned back to the room where Nobunaga was rising from his bedding. "It is treason." "Who?" Nobunaga demanded, his eyes wide, sleep vanishing instantly, replaced by the razor-sharp clarity of a general. He grabbed his bow. "The crest is the bellflower," Yasuke replied. "It is Akechi." Nobunaga paused for only a fraction of a second. A flicker of disbelief crossed his face. Mitsuhide, the refined poet, the master of tea, the loyal general. But the hesitation was momentary. Then there was no help for it. Nobunaga muttered, a fatalistic acceptance of the turning wheel of fortune. Gentle Akechi has turned his fangs. The attack began in earnest. A volley of arrows hissed through the air, thumping into the wooden pillars and piercing the paper screens. The shouts grew louder, transforming into a roar of "the enemy is at Homo-Ju." The Akechi troops, thousands strong, surged toward the inner sanctum. Yasuke stepped forward, placing his massive body between the oncoming tide and his lord. He drew his sword. The blade shimmered in the dim light, a streak of silver lightning in the gloom. He did not feel fear. He felt a cold, focused clarity. This was the moment for which he had been elevated. This was the price of the silk, the rice, the honor. The first wave of attackers reached the veranda. They were samurai, skilled and armored, but they paused when they saw the demon standing at the door. Yasuke towered over them, a giant from another world. He roared, a sound that seemed to shake the very timber of the temple, and swung his blade. The strike was devastating. It cleaved through the spear shaft of the first attacker and bit deep into the shoulder of the second. The strength of 10 men was not a metaphor. Yasuke fought with the power of an ox and the fluidity of a dancer. He used his height to his advantage, swinging the sword in wide, terrifying arcs that kept the enemy at bay. He was a whirlwind of black steel. He kicked a soldier backward, sending him crashing into his comrades, buying precious seconds for Nobunaga to string his bow. Behind him, the string hummed. Nobunaga fired arrow after arrow, his aim true even in the chaos. The lord and his retainer fought back to back, a 2-man army against a legion. But the numbers were overwhelming. For every man Yasuke struck down, 3 more took his place. They swarmed over the garden walls, filling the courtyard until the ground was invisible beneath the press of bodies. "Set the fire." The command came from the Akechi captains. "Burn them out." Torches were thrown onto the dry thatch of the roof. Bundles of straw were ignited and tossed onto the veranda. The wood, seasoned and dry, caught instantly. Flames licked up the pillars, hungry and bright, casting long, dancing shadows that twisted and writhed like spirits. The heat began to rise, suffocating and intense. The orange glow illuminated the sweat on Yasuke's skin, turning it to bronze. The temple, once a sanctuary of peace, became an inferno. The crackling of the fire began to drown out the clash of steel. Smoke billowed through the corridors, stinging the eyes and choking the lungs. Yasuke coughed, swinging his sword to deflect a spear thrust. He felt a sharp pain in his thigh, a grazing cut. But he ignored it. His focus was entirely on the space behind him, the small room where Nobunaga stood. Nobunaga's bowstring snapped. He threw the weapon aside and drew his own spear. He fought with the desperation of a tiger cornered, but he knew the end was written. The fire was enclosing them. The enemy was endless. He looked at Yasuke, the foreign giant who was fighting with such ferocity, bleeding for a cause that was not his by birth but his by choice. "Yasuke!" Nobunaga shouted over the roar of the flames. "It is finished here. Do not let them take my head. It was the final order, the most sacred duty." In the samurai code, the head of a lord was the ultimate prize. To prevent the enemy from claiming it was the last act of loyalty. Yasuke understood, but his heart rebelled. He wanted to fight until he fell, to pile the bodies of the traitors so high they blocked the sun. But he was a samurai now. Obedience was absolute. Nobunaga retreated into the innermost chamber, the flames creating a wall of fire between him and the world. He was preparing to commit seppuku, to take his own life before the fire or the enemy could claim him. Yasuke stood at the threshold, the guardian of the gate, tears mingling with the sweat and soot on his face. He swung his sword again, shattering the helmet of an encroaching soldier. The heat was unbearable now. The roof groaned, the heavy timbers weakening. Yasuke knew he had to move. He had to ensure that Nobunaga's heir, Prince Nobutada, was warned. Nobutada was at the nearby Nijo castle. If the lineage survived, the betrayal could still be avenged. With a final, guttural roar, Yasuke charged into the mass of enemy soldiers. They expected him to die. They did not expect him to attack. The sheer force of his momentum broke their line. He was a juggernaut, smashing through the wall of pikes and armor, running not away from the fight, but through it. He trampled men underfoot, his sword clearing a path through the burning garden. He burst through the encirclement, his lungs burning with smoke, his body battered and bleeding, but alive. Behind him, the main hall of Honnoji collapsed with a thunderous crash, sending a plume of sparks spiraling into the dawn sky. The fire consumed everything. The tea bowls, the scrolls, the body of the warlord who had almost unified Japan. The dragon of Owari was gone, ascended into the smoke. But Yasuke did not stop to mourn, not yet. He ran through the streets of Kyoto, the morning light now revealing a city in panic. The streets were filled with confused citizens and marching troops. He ran toward Nijo Castle, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The image of the burning temple was seared into his mind, a wound that would never heal. The peace of the previous evening felt like a dream from 1,000 years ago. He reached the gates of Nijo Castle just as the sun fully crested the eastern mountains. The guards, seeing the blood-soaked giant, opened the gates. Yasuke stumbled inside, collapsing to one knee in the courtyard. He was exhausted, his body screaming in pain, but his duty was not done. He looked up at the samurai gathering around him, their faces pale with shock as he delivered the news that would shatter the realm. Nobunaga was dead. The world had turned upside down. Yasuke stood up. He tightened his grip on his sword. The fire at Honnoji was a beacon of the end. But here the battle was just beginning. He would fight for the son as he had fought for the father. He would be the shield until the very end. The shadows of the road had swallowed them, but in the heart of the chaos, the black samurai prepared for his final stand. The smoke from the burning temple of Honnoji still clung to the fibers of his clothes, a scent of pine and ash that felt as ancient as the mountains themselves. Here, within the fortified walls of Nijo Castle, the air was different, tenser, sharper, vibrating with the silent screams of a history being rewritten in blood. Yasuke stood in the courtyard, his massive chest heaving with the rhythm of survival. the sweat cooling on his dark skin like the morning dew on iron. The sun was fully up now, casting long, stark shadows across the gravel, and for a fleeting heartbeat, the chaos of the immediate battle receded, replaced by a sudden, overwhelming stillness. It was in this suspended moment, waiting for the inevitable clash of steel that would determine the fate of the Oda legacy, that his mind drifted backward. The roar of the approaching enemy forces outside the gates sounded like the ocean, a dull, rhythmic thrumming that pulled him away from the precipice of death and back to the beginning. The sound of the gathered army was not the sound of war to his ears, but the sound of a city. It reminded him of the day the world had first swallowed him whole, the day he had walked into the city of 10,000 eyes. He remembered the road to Kyoto. It had been a winding ribbon of beaten earth and stone, cutting through valleys, lush with a green so deep it seemed to breathe. He had walked then, not as a warrior, but as a guardian, a shadow trailing the Jesuit visitor Alessandro Valignano. The year was 1581, and the air had tasted of humidity and incense. He remembered the feeling of being a mountain moving among hills. At over 6 feet tall, with skin the colour of deep, polished obsidian, he towered over the people of this island nation. They were like reeds in a river, bending and swaying as he passed, their eyes wide with a mixture of terror and awe. He had come from far away, a journey that spanned oceans and lifetimes. The memories of the Makua people in Mozambique, the heat of the African sun, and the vast, open savannas were etched into his soul, but they felt like a dream from another existence. He had been a man of the Dinka, or perhaps the Habesha. His origins were a tapestry of rumours and half-remembered songs. But here, in this land of mist and cherry blossoms, he was simply the other. To the Jesuits, he was a servant, a strong arm to ward off bandits in a warring state. To the Japanese, he was a myth made flesh. As the procession had neared the capital, the rumours had outpaced their horses. The countryside had whispered of a giant, a man carved from the night itself, possessing the strength of 10 men. By the time they reached the outskirts of Kyoto, the whispers had become a roar. Yasuke closed his eyes in the courtyard of Nijo Castle, letting the memory wash over him. He could almost feel the crush of the crowd again. It had been a suffocating, visceral thing. The streets of Kyoto were narrow, lined with wooden structures that leaned in as if to get a better look. People poured from every alleyway, hanging from windows, climbing the slate roofs of temples and tea houses just to catch a glimpse of him. The sheer weight of their gaze was physical. 10,000 pairs of eyes, widening, tracking his every movement. The noise had been deafening, a cacophony of wooden sandals clattering on stone, shouts of disbelief, and the cracking of timber. He remembered the panic that had rippled through the throng. The curiosity of the capital was a dangerous beast. In their desperation to see him, the people had pushed and shoved, a human tide crashing against the walls of the Jesuit residence. He recalled the sickening sound of a gate giving way, the cries of those crushed beneath the weight of their own fascination. Stones were thrown, not in malice, but in a frantic attempt to provoke a reaction, to prove that the giant was real. It was this riot, this uncontrollable explosion of human curiosity, that had drawn the attention of the dragon himself. The memory shifted, the noise of the crowd fading into the hushed, terrifying silence of a different location. The temple of Honnoju, not the burning ruin he had just fled, but the pristine, golden sanctuary where he had first met Oda Nobunaga. The warlord had heard the commotion from his quarters. He had summoned the cause of the riot, expecting a beast or a trick of the light. Yasuke remembered the walk into the inner sanctum. The sliding doors had parted, revealing a room dominated by the smell of tatami and the aura of absolute power. Nobunaga sat there, a man of slight build compared to Yasuke, but possessing a presence that filled the room like thunder. Nobunaga's eyes were sharp, intelligent, and fiercely skeptical. He had looked at Yasuke not with fear, but with a scientific scrutiny. The warlord did not believe his eyes. In a land where ink and calligraphy were sacred arts, Nobunaga assumed this blackness was a deception, a layer of pigment applied to the skin for theatrical effect. Yasuke remembered the command. It was not spoken with cruelty, but with the cold precision of a man who demanded the truth of all things. Strip to the waist, scrub the skin. In the courtyard of Nijo, Yasuke's hand tightened around the hilt of his sword as he replayed the moment. He had stood there in the heart of the most powerful court in Japan, surrounded by retainers who watched with bated breath. Servants had brought buckets of water and rough cloths. He had allowed them to scrub his chest, his arms, his back. The water ran clear. The scrubbing became harder, the servants confused, their efforts futile against the permanence of his nature. He stood like a statue of black marble, enduring the scrutiny with a quiet dignity that seemed to unsettle and impress the onlookers. When the servants finally pulled back, exhausted and trembling, revealing that the skin was natural, unpainted and true, the silence in the room had shattered. Nobunaga had stood up. The skepticism in his eyes vanished, replaced by a profound delight. The warlord approached him, reaching out to touch the muscle of his arm, marveling at the texture of his skin. To Nobunaga, a man who collected rare tea bowls and Western clocks, Yasuke was the ultimate discovery, a living testament to the vastness of the world. "You are strong," Nobunaga had said, or words to that effect, his voice echoing in the silent hall. "You have the strength of 10 men. You do not seem to be human, but a guardian demon sent to protect the heavens." That moment had been the forge. The heat of Nobunaga's curiosity had burned away the label of servant and replaced it with something new. Yasuke, the name had been given to him then, a sound that fit the cadence of this land, a vessel for his new identity. The warlord had not just seen a curiosity, he had seen a warrior. The transition from the property of the church to the property of the state had been swift. Nobunaga, ever the iconoclast, took pleasure in defying tradition. He saw potential where others saw only strangeness. He granted Yasuke a residence, a stipend, and the ultimate symbol of the warrior class, the sayamaki, a ceremonial sword. Yasuke remembered the weight of that first sword. It was lighter than the heavy clubs or spears of his homeland, but it carried a spiritual weight that was crushing. To carry the two swords was to carry the soul of the samurai. It was a privilege forbidden to farmers, merchants, and certainly foreigners. Yet, within months, the man from Mozambique sat at the table of the unifier of Japan. The days that followed were a blur of rapid assimilation. Yasuke found that the language of this land, with its rhythmic vowels and sharp consonants, found a home on his tongue quickly. Nobunaga loved to talk. He was a man of restless intellect, bored by the sycophancy of his court. He found in Yasuke a candid voice, a man who had seen oceans and empires that Nobunaga could only dream of. They spoke of geography, of the shape of the earth, of the strange gods of the southern barbarians. Yasuke became a fixture in the inner circle, a dark shadow always looming behind the warlord, a visual testament to Nobunaga's reach. There were whispers, of course, the jealous murmurs of other vassals who could not understand why this foreigner was granted such favor. There were rumors that Nobunaga intended to make him a lord, a Tono, with his own castle and lands. The idea was absurd to the traditionalists, but Yasuke knew Nobunaga well enough to know that nothing was impossible. The warlord cared nothing for lineage, only for ability and loyalty, and Yasuke gave him loyalty in abundance. It was a loyalty born of gratitude. In a world that had stripped him of his name and his home, Nobunaga had given him dignity. He had looked at the More Cafre and seen a man, the memory sharpened, focusing on the feeling of the armor he now wore. It was lacquered black, fitting his form like a second skin. He remembered the first time he had donned it, the way the plates kicked together, turning him into a moving fortress. He had learned the way of the sword, the way of the bow, and the way of silence. He had become a kosho, a page of high rank, holding the warlord's weapons, guarding his sleep. He remembered the looks of the people in the streets changed. The city of 10,000 eyes still watched him, but the gaze had shifted. It was no longer the chaotic curiosity of the riot. It was a gaze of fear and respect. When he walked through Kyoto now, or rather, when he had walked through it yesterday, before the fire's people bowed, they pressed their foreheads to the dust, not just for Nobunaga, but for the giant who walked in his shadow. But memories were ghosts, and ghosts could not hold back an army. The reverie in the courtyard of Nijo Castle was broken by a sudden, sharp crack, the sound of a matchlock musket firing in the distance. The noise of the approaching forces had changed pitch. The rhythmic thrumming was gone, replaced by the chaotic shouting of men preparing to breach. Yasuke opened his eyes fully. The green hills of the journey, the crushing crowds of the arrival, the cool water of the scrubbing of the temple, all of it evaporated into the morning heat. He was no longer the curiosity. He was no longer the stranger. He was the retainer of Oda Nobunaga, the heir to the realm. Nobunaga was dead. The man who had given him his name, his sword, and his purpose had vanished into the flames of Honnoji just hours ago. The pillar of the world had collapsed. Now the sun remained. Nobunaga was inside the palace, preparing for his own end. The gathered samurai in the courtyard looked to Yasuke. They were men of lineage, men born to the sword. Yet in this moment of ultimate despair, they looked to the former servant for strength. They saw his size, his calm, his unyielding presence. They saw the strength of 10 men that the chronicles would later record. Yasuke drew his sword. The sound of the steel sliding from the scabbard was a whisper that cut through the tension. The blade gleamed in the morning sun, a sharp silver line against the backdrop of smoke. He was tired. His body ached from the fighting at the temple, his spirit bruised by the loss of his lord, but the fire that Nobunaga had ignited in him still burned. He looked at the gates of Nijo Castle. Beyond them lay the traitor Akehi Mitsuhide's forces, thousands of them. The city of 10,000 eyes was out there, but this time the eyes belonged to archers and spearmen. They were coming to finish what they had started. Yasuke rolled his shoulders, the armor shifting with a familiar weight. He was far from the plains of Africa, far from the Jesuit ships, far from the day he was scrubbed clean in the temple. He was a samurai of the Oda clan. He stepped forward, placing himself between the inner palace and the gate. He would not just be a witness to history today, he would be the wall against which the tide would break. The memory of the crowd's roar faded, replaced by the singular, focused intent of a warrior about to die. The gates groaned, wood splintered. The first of the enemy soldiers spilled into the courtyard, their armor clattering, their shouts bloodthirsty. They paused for a fraction of a second, their momentum arrested by the sight of him, the giant. The black samurai, a demon of war standing alone in the center of the path. Yasuke did not shout, he did not boast. He simply exhaled, a long, slow breath that emptied his mind of everything but the present moment. He raised his sword. The tip pointed at the throat of the onrushing world. The time for spectacle was over. The time for iron had come. The air between the blade and the first attacker seemed to thicken, behaving less like empty space and more like water, slowing the passage of time till every heartbeat thudded like a war drum in Yasuke's ears. The enemy soldier, a spearman with the crest of the Akiki clan lacquered onto his chest plate, lunged with a shout that died in his throat. Yasuke did not simply parry, he moved with the inevitability of a collapsing mountain. His blade, a gift from the Demon King himself, swept upward in a crescent of silver light, meeting the spear shaft and shattering the wood as if it were dry kindling. The force of the blow did not stop at the weapon. It carried through a kinetic wave that sent the soldier stumbling backward into his comrades, disrupting their formation. For a moment, the courtyard fell silent again, the intruders paralyzed by the sheer, impossible physics of what they had just witnessed. They had heard the rumors of the giant from the west. the man with skin like the night sky and the strength of 10 men. But stories were merely wind until they stood before the stone. Yasuke stepped forward, the wooden floorboards of the veranda groaning softly under his stature. He was 6 Shakuran 2, son of coiled muscle and resolve, a towering silhouette against the growing orange glow of the fires ignited behind him. He was no longer the curiosity of the capital, he was the wall. The battle erupted then, not as a duel, but as a swarm. They came at him in 3s and 4s, their fear transmuted into desperate aggression. Yasuke fought with a rhythm that was hypnotic, a brutal dance learned not in the dojos of Kyoto, but forged in the fires of his own survival and refined by the discipline of the samurai. He did not waste movement. Every swing of his sword was a calculated expenditure of energy, backed by the immense power of his shoulders. He caught a descending katana on the flat of his blade, the ring of steel piercing the crackle of the burning temple, and with a twist of his hips, he threw the attacker aside as easily as a man might brush away a dry leaf. Sweat slicked his skin, the moisture mingling with the ash drifting down like grey snow. In the heat of the combat, amidst the screams and the clash of iron, his mind drifted to the sensation of water. He remembered the cold, clear water of the bathhouse in Kyoto, nearly 2 years prior. He remembered the rough bristles of the scrub brush and the confused, frantic scrubbing of Nobunaga's attendants. They had believed his darkness was ink, a trick of the Portuguese missionaries, a layer of deception to be washed away. Yasuke parried a thrust aimed at his midsection, stepping inside the guard of a swordsman and delivering a strike with the pommel of his sword that crumpled the man's breastplate. He remembered Nobunaga's laughter that day. It had not been mocking, but delighted. The warlord, the most feared man in Japan, had looked upon Yasuke's natural skin gleaming, unchangeable, authentic, and seen something kindred. Nobunaga lived his life defying the structures of the world, tearing down old temples and breaking ancient traditions. In Yasuke, he saw a man who defied the very understanding of the Japanese world. He was not ink, he was iron. And iron does not wash away. A roar of fire from the inner chambers snapped his focus back to the present. The heat was becoming oppressive, a physical weight pressing against his armor. The Honoji was dying. The cedar beams were singing their death songs, popping and hissing as the sap boiled within them. Yasuke knew what was happening deep inside the burning complex. His lord Oda Nobunaga was preparing for the end. The tea master of politics, the unifier, the demon king, was composing his final poem, not with ink, but with the short blade of seppuku. Yasuke's duty was no longer to save Nobunaga's life. That thread of fate had been cut the moment Akechi Mitsuhide's army surrounded the temple. His duty now was to buy time, to ensure that the end was honorable, to ensure that no common soldier interrupted the departure of a dragon. He fought with renewed ferocity, a whirlwind of black and steel. He was a creature of 2 worlds, wielding the weapon of the East with the raw power of the South. He fought until his arms burned, until the pile of broken bodies before the veranda formed a grim barricade that the Akechi soldiers hesitated to cross. They looked at him with a mixture of hatred and awe, seeing a guardian demon wreathed in smoke. But the flames were the true victor this night. The roof of the main hall groaned, a sound like a dying beast, and a cascade of sparks showered the courtyard. The heat seared his lungs. There was nothing more to guard here. The presence he had felt behind him, the intense burning will of Oda Nobunaga vanished from the world. A silence, louder than the battle, rippled through the ether. The Lord was gone. Yasuke lowered his sword, his chest heaving. The soldiers watching him sensed it too. The tension broke. The objective had shifted. He did not surrender. To surrender would be to stain the honor Nobunaga had bestowed upon him. He was a samurai, a retainer who had been allowed to dine at the Lord's table, to carry his sword, to speak with him of lands beyond the rising sun. He turned from the inferno, his eyes stinging, and saw the path leading out toward the city. His duty had not ended, it had merely moved. Nobunaga's heir, Oda Nobunaga, was at Nijo Castle, a short distance away. If the route was cut, the branch must be protected. Yasuke charged. It was a maneuver the enemy did not expect. They anticipated a last stand, a suicide charge into their spears. Instead, Yasuke broke through their flank with the force of a stampeding ox. He used his size as a weapon, slamming into the line of soldiers, knocking them off balance, his sword clearing a wide arc. He ran, not in flight, but in pursuit of a new purpose. The streets of Kyoto were a chaotic tapestry of shadows and firelight. The news of the betrayal had spread like a plague wind. Shutters were slammed tight. Dogs barked at the smoke-choked moon. Yasuke ran with long, loping strides, his sandals slapping against the hard-packed earth. He was a ghost in the confusion, a towering figure that appeared and vanished in the alleyways before the terrified sentries could raise an alarm. He reached Nijo Castle just as the dawn began to bleed grey into the black sky. The fortress was already under siege. The Akeki forces, efficient and ruthless, had moved to encircle the air. Yasuke pounded on the gates, his voice booming over the din of the gathering assault. The defenders, seeing the familiar crest of the Oda clan on his armor, seeing the giant who had ridden beside their lord, opened the gates just enough for him to slip through. Inside, the atmosphere was a mirror of the tragedy at Honnoji. Desperation hung heavy in the air. Prince Nobunaga was organizing the defense, but his eyes held the grim recognition of the inevitable. When he saw Yasuke, a flicker of surprise, perhaps even hope, crossed his face. Here was the man his father had trusted, the man who had come from the ends of the earth to die in Kyoto. Yasuke did not speak. He knelt, bowing his head to the floor, pledging his sword to the son as he had to the father. There was no time for tea ceremonies or poetry. The walls of Nijo were strong, but the enemy was legion. The final battle was a blur of exhaustion and instinct. Yasuke fought at the breach, standing shoulder to shoulder with men who had once looked at him with suspicion, but now looked at him as a brother in arms. The racial curiosity had evaporated in the heat of combat. Blood is the same color when it hits the ground, and bravery speaks a universal language. He swung his sword until the metal was notched and dull. He fought until his limbs felt like lead, fueled only by the memory of the dignity he had been given. He was not a slave. He was not a servant. He was a warrior of the Oda. But the tide was too great. The walls were breached. The defenders fell one by one, their cries swallowed by the roar of the victors. Nobunaga, like his father, chose the honorable path of self-destruction rather than capture. Yasuke found himself the last standing sentinel in a corridor filled with smoke and the fallen. He was surrounded. 50 spears pointed at his chest. Archers drew their strings taut on the walls above. He stood amidst the carnage, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his armor battered, his skin slick with sweat and soot. He tightened his grip on his sword, prepared to charge one last time, to die as a samurai should, in a blaze of violence that would be sung about for generations. "Hold!" The command came from behind the wall of spears. The soldiers parted, and a high-ranking samurai stepped forward. It was not Mitsuhide himself, but one of his chief vassals. The man looked at Yasuke, his eyes widening as he took in the sheer scale of the foreign warrior. He looked at the blood on Yasuke's sword, the bodies arranged around him like offerings to a dark god. The order was given not to kill, but to capture. They rushed him then, a dozen men piling onto him, using their combined weight to drag him to the ground. Yasuke roared, throwing 2 of them off, but the sheer mass was overwhelming. Ropes were brought, thick hemp cords that bit into his skin as they bound his wrists and arms. They stripped him of his swords, the ceremonial sayamaki that Nobunaga had given him, the symbol of his status. The loss of the sword hurt more than the blows they rained down upon him. It was the stripping away of his soul. They marched him through the ruined streets of Kyoto, a trophy of the rebellion. The people who had once climbed rooftops to catch a glimpse of the Black Lord now peeked through cracks in the wood, their eyes filled with fear and confusion. Was this the end of the age of giants? He was brought to the Akechi headquarters and forced to his knees in a courtyard. The gravel dug into his shins. He kept his head high, refusing to look down. He waited for the executioner's blade. He waited for the cold kiss of steel on his neck that would send him to join his lord in the void. Akechi Mitsuhide emerged onto the veranda. The usurper. The man who had killed the sun. He looked pale, his face drawn with the magnitude of what he had done, a coup that would ultimately fail, though he did not know it yet. He looked down at Yasuke, the silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Yasuke looked directly into Mitsuhide's eyes. In that exchange, there was a clash of civilizations. Mitsuhide was a traditionalist, a man of conservative values who had despised Nobunaga's embrace of the foreign, the new, the strange. Yasuke was the embodiment of everything Mitsuhide feared: the unknown, the disruption of order, the strength that came from outside the meticulous gardens of Japanese society. Mitsuhide's lip curled. He did not see the loyalty. He did not see the samurai who had fought 2 armies in one night. He saw only the surface. He saw the ink, not the iron. The black man, Mitsuhide said, his voice carrying a deliberate, disdainful calm. He is a beast. He knows nothing of our ways. He is not Japanese. The words hung in the air, sharper than any katana. They were designed to strip Yasuke of his humanity, to invalidate the honor he had earned through blood and service. To kill him as a samurai would be to acknowledge him as one. Mitsuhide would not grant him that dignity. "Do not kill him," Mitsuhide commanded, waving his hand dismissively, as if swatting away a fly. "He is a temple animal. Send him back to the Nanbandera, to the priests. Let him be their problem." The soldiers looked confused. To spare a dangerous enemy was unwise, but they obeyed. They hauled Yasuke to his feet. He did not struggle. The insult had cut deep, but it had also spared his life. There was a bitter irony in it. The racism that had made him a spectacle was now the very thing that prevented his death. He was too alien to be executed as a man. They marched him to the Jesuit church, the Nanbandera. The foreign priests, terrified by the political upheaval, received him with trembling hands. They cut his bonds. Yasuke stood in the nave of the church, the smell of incense replacing the smell of burning cedar. The silence of the cross replaced the roar of the battlefield. He rubbed his wrists where the ropes had burned him. He was alive. The demon king was dead. The dream of a unified Japan under the Oda banner had collapsed into ash, and Yasuke, the obsidian samurai, was once again a man between worlds. The historical records fracture here. The ink of the chroniclers runs dry. Some say he stayed with the Jesuits, weeping for the Lord who had seen him as a man. Some say he took a ship back to the warm waters of the Indian Ocean, carrying the memories of snow and steel. Others whisper that he remained in Japan, a ronin wandering the misty roads of the north, a giant shadow in the twilight, waiting for a master worthy of his strength. But on that day, as the smoke cleared over Kyoto, Yasuke stepped out of the church and looked up at the sky. It was the same sky that covered Mozambique, the same sky that covered the great oceans. He was alone, as he had been when he arrived. He walked forward, away from the temple, away from the ruins of the nobility that had briefly embraced him. His armor was gone, but the strength in his limbs remained. The history books would close on his name, leaving only fragments and rumors, but the man himself continued. He walked into the haze of the city, his footsteps heavy and steady on the earth. He was no longer a curiosity. He was a survivor, and as his figure faded into the white mist that rolled down from the mountains, he became something more enduring than flesh. He became a legend, etched not in ink, but in the iron will of those who refused to be forgotten. The mist swallowed him whole, leaving only the silence of the aftermath, a silence that seemed to wait for the next turn of the wheel, for the next soul to rise from the dust and claim their place in the story of the world. The mist that swallowed the lone figure on the road did not erase the path he had traveled. Rather, It seemed to carry the memory of his footsteps back to the beginning, back to the forge where the man was reshaped into iron. Before the legend dissolved into the white haze of history, there was the weight of the steel itself and the discipline that turned a stranger into a warrior. To understand the shadow that walked away from the burning temple, one must first understand the light that gleamed off the blade in the courtyard of Azuchi Castle, where the air smelled of pine resin and the sharp, metallic tang of polished weaponry. The story of the sword begins not with the strike, but with the stillness. In the heart of the warlord's domain, amidst the chaotic ambition of the Sengoku period, Yasuke found a center of gravity that was entirely new. He had known strength all his life. His body was a testament to survival, forged in the heat of Mozambique, tempered by the long salt spray voyages across the Indian Ocean, and hardened by the labor of service. He stood over 6 feet tall, a giant among the people of this island nation, with shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of worlds and muscles that moved with the fluid power of a panther. But the strength of a samurai was different. It was not merely the exertion of force, it was the precise containment of it. In the early mornings, when the sky was the color of bruised plums and the dew still clung to the manicured gardens, the training would begin. The wooden practice sword, the bokken, felt light in his massive hands, almost like a toy compared to the heavy clubs or spears of his homeland. Yet the masters of the house taught him that the lightness was a deception. The sword was an extension of the soul, they said. To wield it was to wield one's own spirit. Yasuke learned to grip the hilt not with crushing force, but with a firmness that allowed the wood to breathe. He learned that the cut began in the hips, in the earth beneath his feet, traveling up through the spine and releasing through the arms like water flowing through a channel. It was a transformation of the mind as much as the body. He remembered the day he first stood before Oda Nobunaga, not as a warrior, but as a curiosity. The memory was vivid, painted in the loud, chaotic strokes of Kyoto's streets. He had arrived with the Jesuit visitor Alessandro Valignano, a towering figure in his own right, but it was Yasuke who had stopped the breath of the city. The capital had erupted into a frenzy. People had climbed the wooden roofs of the low buildings, crushing tiles and straining timbers, just to catch a glimpse of the man whose skin was the color of midnight. The press of bodies had been suffocating, a riot born of sheer wonder. Nobunaga, the demon king of Owari, the unifier of Japan, had heard the roar of the crowd from his residence at Honnoju. He was a man who collected the world's rarities, tei bowls, paintings, foreign clocks, and he demanded to see the source of this disturbance. When Yasuke was brought before him, the warlord sat on the raised tatami, his eyes sharp and hawk-like, piercing through the layers of ceremony. He had never seen a man like Yasuke. The deep, rich obsidian of his skin was so perfect, so uniform, that Nobunaga could not believe it was natural. In a moment that would ripple through history, Nobunaga ordered his attendants to bring water and scrub the stranger's skin. He suspected ink. He suspected a trick. Yasuke stood stoic, allowing the rough cloth to pass over his chest and arms. The water ran clear. The skin remained, glistening like wet stone, undeniably real. When the truth settled upon the room, the tension broke, replaced by a profound fascination. Nobunaga did not recoil. He leaned forward. He saw not a beast, but a marvel. He touched the skin that refused to fade, and in that contact, the barrier between master and servant, between foreigner and native, began to dissolve. Nobunaga declared that this man possessed the strength of 10 men, a titan sent from the edges of the known world. That day, the scrubbing of the skin became a baptism. The water washed away the identity of the servant and revealed the canvas of the samurai. Nobunaga, a man who defied tradition at every turn, saw potential where others saw only difference. He took Yasuke from the Jesuit, stripping him of his role as a valet and clothing him in the silk and steel of the Oda clan. Now, in the quiet of the dojo, Yasuke moved through the forms, the kata, repeating the motions until they were etched into his muscle memory. Suburi, the repetitive practice of the overhead cut. Up, down, up, down. The rhythm became a meditation. The sweat that rolled down his back was no longer the sweat of a porter carrying luggage. It was the purification of a warrior preparing for death. He learned to silence the noise of his thoughts. The Japanese language, initially a wall of incomprehensible sounds, began to unravel into meaning. He had a natural ear for the cadence of speech, perhaps born of a life listening to the varied tongues of the trade routes. Nobunaga loved to talk, and Yasuke learned to listen and eventually to speak. They would sit on the veranda of the castle overlooking Lake Biwa, the water shimmering like a sheet of hammered silver under the moon. Nobunaga, the most feared man in Japan, would ask about the great oceans, about the shape of the African continent, about the animals that roamed the savannas. Yasuke described the elephants, the lions, the vast open skies that stretched forever. In return, Nobunaga spoke of a unified realm, of a peace forged through the fire of war. He treated Yasuke not as a pet, but as a confidant. The other retainers watched with a mixture of jealousy and awe. To eat at the warlord's table, to carry his sword, to be the guardian of his door. These were honors men killed for, and they had been bestowed upon the stranger from the south. The culmination of this journey was the bestowal of the Sayamaki. It was a ceremonial sword, a short blade with a scabbard of exquisite craftsmanship. The day Nobunaga presented it to him, the air was thick with the humidity of summer. The cicadas cried from the cypress trees, a deafening chorus that seemed to vibrate in the chest. Yasuke knelt on the tatami, his head bowed. The wooden floor was polished to a mirror shine, reflecting the somber faces of the senior vassals. Nobunaga held the weapon out. The hilt was wrapped in shark skin and bound with silk cord. The lacquer of the scabbard was deep and black, matching the skin of the man who would wield it. "Rise," Nobunaga commanded, his voice cutting through the drone of the insects. "You are no longer a guest in this land. You are a sword of the Oda. You are Bushi." Yasuke took the weapon. It was heavier than it looked, dense with the labor of the smith and the history of the clan. As he slid the blade a fraction of an inch from the sheath, the steel gleamed with a lethal cold beauty. The heiman, the temper line along the edge, waved like the mist over the mountains. In that metal, he saw his new face. He was Yasuke. The name itself had been a gift from Nobunaga, a Japanese rendering that sounded strong, simple, and noble. With a sword came the house, a private residence in the castle town, and a stipend that ensured his comfort. But the true currency of his new life was respect. When he walked the streets of Azuchi now, the crowds still stared, but they did not push. They parted. They bowed. They saw the two swords at his waist, the long katana and the short wakizashi, and they recognized the crest on his kimono. He was a retainer of the Lord of the Realm. He was a man who walked in the shadow of the dragon. But the way of the sword was not merely about status. It was about the readiness to die. Yasuke understood that the kindness of Nobunaga was tied to the volatility of the era. Peace was a fragile illusion, maintained by the threat of violence. He doubled his efforts in training. He sparred with the other pages, men who had been raised with a sword in their cribs. At first, they relied on speed, trying to outmaneuver the giant. But Yasuke learned to use his reach, his immense stride, and his overpowering strength to control the center. When he struck, it was like a falling tree, inevitable and crushing. Yet, under the tutelage of the master instructors, he learned to soften the impact, to stop the wooden blade a hair's breadth from his opponent's skin, demonstrating the ultimate control. One evening, as autumn painted the mountains in shades of fire and gold, Yasuke sat alone in his quarters, cleaning the blade Nobunaga had given him. The paper screens of the shoji doors were slid open, revealing a garden of raked sand and moss. The world outside was silent, save for the wind rustling the drying leaves. He held the naked steel in his hands, oiling it with a soft cloth. The smell of clove oil filled the small room, a scent that would forever define his memory of peace. He thought of the long journey that had brought him here, the dusty villages of the Makwa people, the terrifying vastness of the slaver's ship, the strange incense-filled churches of the Jesuits in India, and finally, this island of warriors. He had been many things: a son, a captive, a servant, a bodyguard. But as he looked at the reflection in the blade, he saw a continuity. The warrior spirit had always been there, waiting for the right shape to contain it. Japan had not changed him so much as it revealed him. The connection between Yasuke and Nobunaga deepened as the months turned into years. It was a bond forged in the contrast of their existences. Nobunaga was a man of the mind, strategic, ruthless, constantly calculating the movements of armies and the intrigues of the court. Yasuke was a man of the body and the heart, loyal, immediate, grounded in the physical reality of the moment. Nobunaga found rest in Yasuke's presence. The warlord, who slept little and trusted fewer, would often have Yasuke stand guard while he rested, trusting the giant to be the wall between him and the assassins that lurked in the shadows. There was a specific incident during a hunt that cemented this trust. The retinue had ventured into the dense forest surrounding Kyoto, chasing wild boar. The brush was thick, the terrain uneven and treacherous. A boar, maddened by the chase, had broken through the line of beaters and charged towards the lord's position. It was a beast of considerable size, tusks gleaming, eyes rolling in fury. Before the other attendants could draw their bows, Yasuke had stepped forward. He did not use a weapon. With a roar that rivaled the animal's own, he had braced himself and met the charge, using a long staff to deflect the beast's momentum, turning it aside with a display of raw power that left the other samurai stunned. He stood between the danger and his lord, an immovable object. Nobunaga had laughed, a rare, genuine sound of delight, and praised the demon strength that protected him. But the way of the sword is also a lonely path. Yasuke knew that he would always be an outsider. Even as he stood at the center of power, he saw the looks of the other lords, men like Akechi Mitsuhide, whose eyes held a mixture of disdain and calculation. To them, Yasuke was a disruption of the natural order, a foreign element introduced into the sacred hierarchy of the samurai. Yasuke sensed the tension, the undercurrent of resentment that flowed beneath the polished surface of the court. He sharpened his instincts along with his blade. He learned to read the silence in a room, to detect the hidden meanings in a polite conversation. He adopted the customs with a reverence that impressed even the skeptics. He learned the tea ceremony, the chanoyu. In the small rustic tea huts, he would crouch his massive frame, humbling himself before the scroll and the flower arrangement. He learned to appreciate the wabi-sabi, the beauty of imperfection and transience. Watching the steam rise from the green tea, he understood that his time here, like the cherry blossom, was beautiful because it was precarious. His rise had been meteoric, a defiance of gravity, and he knew that such heights were often dizzying. As the winter of 1581 settled over Azuchi, blanketing the castle in snow, Yasuke's transformation was complete. He walked with the rolling gait of a man who carried lethal force at his hip. He spoke the language of the court. He wore the crest of the Oda. He was no longer the more carefree of the Jesuit reports. He was Yasuke-sama to the servants, a figure of authority and awe. The snow fell softly on the tiled roofs, muffling the world. Yasuke stood on the ramparts of the great keep, looking out over the white landscape. The cold air bit at his face, sharp and invigorating. He felt a profound sense of gratitude. Fate had carried him across oceans of suffering to place him here on the roof of the world, serving the man who held the heavens in his hand. He gripped the hilt of his sword, the leather cord rough against his palm. He was ready. He did not know what the spring would bring, or what fires would burn when the snow melted, but he knew his purpose. He was the shield. He was the sword. He was the black samurai, and he would stand firm until the earth itself gave way. The silence of the winter night was absolute, a blank page waiting for the ink of history. But in the distance, beyond the snowy peaks, the drums of war were never truly silent. The alliances of the Sengoku period were shifting like sand dunes in a storm. Resentment was building in the hearts of ambitious men. The way of the sword leads inevitably to the battlefield, and Yasuke, standing tall against the winter sky, could feel the vibrations of the coming earthquake. The era of peace was a dream, and the waking world was one of blood and iron. He breathed in the icy air, filling his lungs, and exhaled a cloud of white mist that drifted up, mingling with the stars. The path from the training grounds to the battlefield is often shorter than one expects. For Yasuke, the days of drilling in the sun and the nights of quiet conversation were drawing to a close. The wheel of fortune which had lifted him so high was beginning its slow, inexorable turn downward. But he did not fear the turn. He had mastered the self. He had mastered the self. He had mastered the steel, and as the seasons turned towards the fateful year of 1582, he carried within him the quiet, burning resolve of a man who has found his place in the universe, however temporary it might be. The snow melted, revealing the dark earth beneath, and the camellias began to bloom red flowers that fell whole from the stem, reminiscent of severed heads, a poetic omen that the samurai knew well. The time for training was over. The time for proving the way of the sword was at hand. Yasuke tightened his obi, checked the edge of his blade, and stepped forward to meet the destiny that awaited him in the capital. The legend was already written. Now, the man had to live it. The air grew warmer, heavy with the scent of rain and impending storms, as the entourage prepared to move towards Kyoto, towards the temple of Honnoji, where the final test of loyalty would commence. The road to the capital was long, winding through valleys where the mist clung to the cedar trees like a forgotten spirit, but in the mind of the warrior, the journey was not measured in miles, but in the distance between the man he once was and the man he had become. As the entourage moved with the rhythmic clatter of hooves and the rustle of silk standards against the wind, Yasuke's thoughts drifted back from the blooming camellias of the present to the golden fortress that had birthed his new soul. To understand the weight of the sword at his hip, one had to understand the height of the tower from which he had surveyed the world. He remembered Azuchi. It was more than a castle. It was a mountain carved into the shape of ambition. Rising from the shores of Lake Biwa, Azuchi Castle pierced the heavens, a testament to the audacity of Oda Nobunaga. Its walls were stone and plaster, but its heart was gold and lacquer, a labyrinth of tiger paintings and vermilion pillars that seemed to burn even in the darkest night. It was here, within the shadow of the great keep, that the transformation had taken root. Yasuke rode now with the posture of a nobleman, his spine straight, his gaze fixed on the horizon. But the memory of his arrival in this land was still vivid, etched into his consciousness like the scars of old battles. He remembered the year 1579, arriving not as a warrior, but as a guardian to the Jesuit visitor, Alessandro Valignano. He had been a curiosity then, a figure of immense speculation, standing over 6 shaku and 2 sunna giants of 6 feet and 2 inches in a land where men rarely passed 5 feet. He had towered over the crowds like a cedar in a field of bamboo. The air in Kyoto, upon his first entry, had been thick enough to choke on. It was a sensation of crushing humanity. The news of his arrival had spread like fire through dry straw, igniting a fervour that the capital had rarely seen. They called him a more cafre in the Portuguese tongue. A man from the lands of the Mozambique coast, perhaps of the Makua people, or born of the tall, proud lineages of the interior. To the people of Kyoto, he was a myth made flesh. They had surged forward, a tide of faces and grasping hands, climbing over the roofs of flimsy wooden structures, crushing gates, and trampling one another just to catch a glimpse of the man whose skin was the colour of the midnight sky. He remembered the noise, a roar of voices, a cacophony of shock and wonder. He had stood firm amidst the chaos, the strength of 10 men coiled within his limbs, protecting the Jesuit priests who looked upon the riot with trembling fear. It was this commotion, this disruption of the heavenly order, that had drawn the attention of the dragon himself. The summons from Oda Nobunaga had been swift. In the quiet chambers of the warlord's residence, away from the screaming throngs, The air became still. Yasuke remembered the smell of tatami mats and incense, the sharp metallic scent of polished steel. Nobunaga sat upon a raised dais, a man of hawkish intensity, his eyes burning with an intelligence that dissected everything it beheld. When Yasuke entered, ducking his head beneath the lintel, the room seemed to shrink. The warlord did not believe his eyes. In a world of ink and parchment, Nobunaga suspected a trick. He ordered the stranger to strip to the waist. It was a moment of vulnerability, a stripping away of the protective layers of cloth and status. Servants brought water in wooden buckets, and with rough cloths they scrubbed Yasuke's chest and arms. The water ran clear. The skin remained dark, glistening like wet obsidian, unyielding and true. It was then that the fear in the room transmuted into awe. Nobunaga, the demon king, the destroyer of temples and unifier of realms, stepped down from his dais. He touched the skin that could not be washed away. He looked up into the face of the man who stood a head and shoulders above him. The warlord laughed, not in mockery, but in delight. He declared that this man was a marvel, a being of strength and stature that defied the known limits of humanity. That day, the servant died and the seed of the samurai was planted. The transition was not merely one of title, but of soul. Nobunaga, a man who cared nothing for tradition and everything for ability, took Yasuke into his inner circle. He was given a name, Yasuke sound, that rolled off the Japanese tongue, grounding him in the earth of this archipelago. He was given a residence, a private space where he could rest his head not as a piece of property, but as a man of means. He was granted a stipend, the coin of the realm flowing into his hands, validating his worth. But the greatest gift was the steel. Yasuke's hand drifted to the hilt of his sayamaki, the ceremonial sword that rested at his waist. He recalled the moment it was presented to him. The weight of it was substantial, a curved bar of folded iron that contained the soul of the smith and the honor of the wielder. To carry two swords, the long and the short, was the exclusive privilege of the samurai class. It was a declaration to the world that he held the power of life and death, that he was bound by the code of Bushido, even if he had been born beneath the burning sun of Africa. Life in Azuchi became a rhythm of discipline and elevation. Yasuke learned that strength was nothing without form. He trained with the spear and the sword, his massive reach giving him an advantage that few could counter. When he sparred, it was said that he moved with the force of an ox, but the grace of a panther. The retainers who had once looked at him with suspicion now looked at him with a grudging, fearful respect. He was the black guardian of the warlord, the shadow that stood behind the light of Nobunaga's ambition. Yet, it was not only his muscle that secured his place. Nobunaga was a man of voracious intellect, easily bored by the sycophants who surrounded him. He found in Yasuke a window to a wider world. The Jesuits wrote in their letters home that the warlord never tired of talking to him. Yasuke learned the language with a speed that surprised the scholars. He learned the cadence of the court, the subtle inflections of respect and command. He sat at Nobunaga's table in honor reserved for only the highest vassals, and spoke of the vast oceans, of the shape of the earth, of peoples and beasts that the Japanese had never imagined. In these quiet evenings, looking out over the moonlit waters of Lake Biwa, the barrier between master and retainer thinned. They were two singular men, isolated by their own uniqueness. Nobunaga, the revolutionary who sought to break the old Japan, and Yasuke, the stranger who had broken the boundaries of what was thought possible. The bond deepened as the seasons turned. Whispers began to circulate through the corridors of Azuchi, rumors that carried both wonder and jealousy. It was said that Nobunaga intended to make Yasuke a lord. The rumor was captured in the letters of the Jesuit Lorenzo Messia, a testament to the meteoric rise of the former servant. To be a lord was to hold land, to command a castle, to have retainers of one's own. It was a height that no foreigner had ever reached, a shattering of the rigid social hierarchy that governed the land. Yasuke did not let the rumors cloud his mind. He focused on the immediate, on the tangible reality of his duty. He wore the kimono and the hakama as if he had been born to them, the silk settling over his broad shoulders, the crest of the Oda clan becoming a part of his identity. He walked the halls of Azuchi with a silent, imposing grace, his footsteps heavy yet controlled. He was the obsidian wall between his lord and the many enemies who sought to tear down the unification of Japan. And there were many enemies. The higher they rose, the thinner the air became. As the year 1582 unfolded, the atmosphere in Azuchi shifted. The cherry blossoms fell, replaced by the deep greens of summer, but a tension vibrated in the earth. The campaigns were endless. The armies were constantly on the move. Yasuke felt the restlessness in Nobunaga, a driving need to complete the great work, to bring the western provinces under the umbrella of his power. The decision to move to Kyoto was made. The great castle of Azuchi would be left behind for a time. Nobunaga would travel with a small, intimate retinue to the temple of Honnoji, a place of peace in the heart of the capital, to prepare for the campaign against the Mori clan. It was to be a routine stop, a moment of respite before the storm of war resumed. Yasuke rode near the front of the column, his eyes scanning the tree line, his senses attuned to the rhythm of the march. The rain began to fall again, a soft, warm drizzle that misted the world in grey. He felt the water on his skin, cool and cleansing, reminding him of that day in the audience chamber when the water had proven his humanity. Now the water anointed him as a warrior. He looked at the backs of the men riding ahead, the banners limp in the damp air. He felt a profound sense of belonging. He was no longer the exile, the curiosity, the morque fray. He was Yasuke, retainer of the Oda, a man who had crossed oceans and cultures to find his destiny in the service of the dragon. The past was a dream of heat and dust. The present was the cool rain and the steel at his side. The road wound onward, leading them away from the safety of the Golden Castle, down from the heights of Azuchi and into the valley of Kyoto. The city awaited them. The temple awaited them. The threads of fate were being pulled tight, woven by hands unseen in the loom of history. Yasuke adjusted his grip on the reins. The horse beneath him was strong, a beast bred for war, and it responded to his slightest touch. He felt the pulse of the animal, the pulse of the land, and the pulse of his own heart, all beating in a slow, synchronized rhythm. Thump, 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 thump. It was the sound of a rising tide, the sound of an approaching storm. He thought of the conversations with Nobunaga, the shared laughter, the quiet understanding. He thought of the trust that had been placed in him. He knew that whatever lay ahead in the capital, he would stand as the shield. He would be the darkness that protected the light. He would honor the sword that had been given to him, and the name that had been bestowed upon him. The mountains grew closer, their peaks shrouded in the low-hanging clouds. The smell of wet earth and pine was overpowering, a sensory blanket that wrapped around the travelers. The world seemed to narrow, focusing down to this single path, this single moment in time. The glorious rise at Azuchi was complete. The summit had been reached. Now the path led down into the basin of Kyoto, toward the temple walls that would soon witness the ultimate test of the samurai spirit. As the silhouette of the capital's gates began to emerge through the mist, Yasuke let out a slow breath, centering his spirit. The rise was over. The stand was about to begin. The rhythmic drumming of the rain on his lacquered armor sounded like 1,000 tiny fingers tapping a warning, or perhaps an applause for the final act that was yet to come. He rode on, the black samurai, into the heart of the gathering twilight, ready to meet the history that waited for him at Honnoji. The rain that had escorted them from the mountain passes began to soften as the great capital of Kyoto materialized from the grey mist. It was not a sudden arrival, but a slow immersion into the heart of the realm. The mud of the Tokaido road gave way to the paved avenues of the city, stones slick and shining like polished obsidian under the weeping sky. Here the air tasted different. It was heavy with the scent of centuries burning incense, wet pine, charcoal fires, and the unspoken weight of power. Yasuke, riding tall within the small retinue, felt the shift in atmosphere in Azuchi. The air was electric with newness and ambition, vibrating with the energy of the castle that scraped the heavens. But here in Kyoto, the air was old, settled, and watchful. They moved through the streets, the rhythmic clatter of hooves echoing off the wooden facades of merchant houses and shuttered shops. The citizens who caught glimpses of the procession peered through cracks in the wood, their eyes widening in the dim light. They saw the crest of the Oda clan, the flowering melon, damp and clinging to the banners. And they saw him. Even in the fading light, the figure of Yasuke demanded attention. He was a mountain moving among hills. At 6, shaku and 2 sana, towering 6 feet and 2 inches, he loomed over the horses and the men around him. In a land where the average warrior stood a full foot shorter, Yasuke appeared to be a being sculpted from a different clay, forged in a fire unknown to these islands. The destination was not a fortress of stone and iron, but a place of prayer and temporary respite. Honoju, the temple walls rose from the damp earth, enclosing a sanctuary of gravel gardens, wooden verandas, and paper screens. It was a place of vulnerability, chosen for its location and its peace, not its defensibility. Nobunaga, the unifier, the demon king, had come here with only a light guard, confident in his absolute dominance over the central provinces. He believed the war was on the horizon, far to the west where his generals fought, not here, in the beating heart of the capital. As they dismounted, the steam rose from the horses' flanks, mingling with the fog. Yasuke handed the reins to a stable hand who trembled slightly, not from the cold, but from the sheer presence of the black samurai. Yasuke's movements were fluid, possessed of a grace that belied his massive frame. He carried the double swords of his station with an ease that spoke of the warrior soul within. He was no longer the curiosity that had caused a near riot upon his first arrival in this city years ago. He was a kosho, a weapon and a shield at the right hand of the most powerful man in Japan. The evening settled over Honoji with a deceptive tranquility. The rain ceased, leaving behind a humidity that clung to the skin, a thick, warm blanket that muffled sound. Inside the temple complex, the world of war seemed to recede. Nobunaga, ever the aesthete, retired to his quarters to admire his collection of tea utensils, treasures he valued more than provinces. Yasuke remained close, his duty as a page and bodyguard keeping him within the inner circle. It was in these quiet hours, amidst the sliding of silk on tatami and the bubbling of iron kettles, that the depth of their bond was most visible. Nobunaga, a man of mercurial temper and terrifying intellect, found a rare solace in Yasuke's company. The Jesuit letters had noted that the warlord never tired of speaking with him, and tonight was no different. Yasuke, fluent now in the language of his lord, spoke with the cadence of the court, his deep voice resonating in the small timbered rooms. They did not speak of strategy or logistics, but of the world beyond the seas, of the shape of the earth, of the customs of the Marquard people, or the vast landscapes of Africa. In the flickering light of the oil lamps, the shadows danced on the gold-leaf screens, casting the two men, one, the unifier of Japan, the other, the voyager from Mozambique, into a tableau of quiet understanding. Rumors had whispered through the ranks that Nobunaga intended to make Yasuke a Tono, a lord in his own right, perhaps granting him a castle and a fiefdom. It was an elevation unheard of, a shattering of tradition that only a mind like Nobunaga's could conceive. As Yasuke knelt in the attendance of his master, adjusting the charcoal in the brazier, he was not merely a servant. He was the physical manifestation of Nobunaga's desire to conquer the unknown, to embrace the strength of the entire world. But the night waned, and the heavy silence of the darkest hours, the hour of the ox, settled over Kyoto. The temple grew still. The guards posted at the gates leaned on their spears, eyes heavy, listening to the drip of water from the eaves. Yasuke retired to his nearby quarters, though sleep came lightly to men of his profession. He lay listening to the breathing of the city, the distant bark of a dog, the rustle of the wind in the bamboo. It was not a sound that woke him, but a feeling, a tremor in the earth, a disruption in the rhythm of the night. It began as a low rumble, indistinguishable at first from the receding thunder of the storm. But it grew steady, rhythmic, and multiplied. The sound of hooves, not of few, but thousands, the clattering of armor plates, the sashimono flag snapping in the pre-dawn breeze. It was the sound of an army moving with intent. Yasuke was on his feet before the first shout pierced the air. He donned his armor with practiced speed, the lacquered plates securing over his chest, the weight familiar and grounding. He grabbed his sword, the katana that had been a gift from Nobunaga, its blade sharp enough to sever soul from body. He stepped out into the cool grey light of early dawn, his senses expanding to take in the chaos that was blooming like a dark flower. Voices cried out from the gates. A brawl? Someone shouted, thinking perhaps the lower-ranking soldiers were fighting among themselves. No! Another voice screamed, tight with terror. The banners! Look at the banners. Through the mist and the gloom they appeared, light blue flags bearing the crest of the bellflower, the Kaikyo crest. It was not a foreign enemy. It was not the Mori clan from the west or the Uesugi from the north. It was Akechi Mitsuhide, the most trusted general, the man who had marched his troops west ostensibly to aid in the war, had turned his army back. He had marched through the night, crossing the rivers, entering the capital, and now he had surrounded the temple. The enemy is at Hollow-ji. The famous cry echoed through the ranks of the rebels, 13,000 strong, encircling a temple guard of less than 100. The air shattered. Arrows began to rain down into the courtyard, thumping into the wooden pillars, skittering across the gravel, finding soft flesh. The tranquility of the tea ceremony was obliterated by the guttural roar of betrayal. Yasuke did not hesitate. He moved toward the inner sanctum, his stride eating up the ground. He found Nobunaga already awake, standing on the veranda, looking out at the sea of blue banners. There was no fear in the warlord's eyes, only a cold, sharp realization. The game had changed. The board had been flipped. It is inevitable, Nobunaga murmured, grabbing his bow. Yasuke took his position. The rebels were breaching the gates now, pouring into the temple grounds like a flood of steel. They expected light resistance. They expected panic. What they found was a demon of shadow and iron. Yasuke stood at the entrance to the Lord's quarters, a towering monolith blocking the path. When the first wave of Akechi soldiers rushed the veranda, spears levelled, they faltered for a fraction of a second at the sight of him. In the dawn light, his dark skin seemed to absorb the shadows, his eyes burning with a ferocity that stopped the breath in their throats. Then the violence erupted. Yasuke moved with a speed that defied his size. He stepped inside the guard of the first attacker, sweeping his blade in a brutal arc that shattered the ashward shaft of the spear and continued through the armor. The man fell without a sound. The second soldier lunged, but Yasuke caught the spear shaft with his bare hand, the strength of his grip cracking the wood, and drove a pommel strike into the man's helmet, crumpling the metal like paper. The Shincho Koki would later record that he possessed the strength of 10 men, and in this narrow corridor of death, he proved it. He was a storm contained in human form. He did not fight with the rigid, formalized technique of the academy. He fought with a visceral, overpowering dominance. He used his height to strike from angles the Japanese soldiers could not defend, bringing his blade down like a thunderbolt. He used his mass to shoulder-check armored men, sending them flying backward off the veranda into the gravel below. He was fighting for time. Every second he held the door was a second Nobunaga had to compose his end. Beside him fought Mori Ranmaru, the young page, lithe and desperate, his spear flashing like a serpent's tongue. Together, the giant and the youth held back the tide. But the tide was rising. The air began to grow hot, suffocatingly so. The rebels, unable to easily bypass the monster guarding the door, had resorted to fire. Torches were thrown onto the thatched roofs. Oil was splashed onto the wooden verandas. The dry timber of the temple, aged and seasoned, caught with a terrifying hunger. Orange flames licked up the walls, curling towards the sky, competing with the rising sun. The smell of incense was replaced by the acrid stench of burning pine and melting lacquer. The heat became a physical weight pressing against Yasuke's armor. Sweat ran in rivulets down his back, stinging his eyes. The smoke billowed thick and black, obscuring the enemy, turning the battle into a phantasmagoria of shadows and silhouettes. From behind him, deep within the burning structure, came the sound of a heavy thud, followed by silence. Nobunaga had done it. He had committed seppuku, slicing open his abdomen to deny the enemy his head, ordering his body to be burned to ash so that no trophy could be taken. The duty of the guard was finished. The Lord was gone. But the warriors' war was not over. The temple was collapsing around them. Beams crashed down in showers of sparks. The heat was blistering, the very air turning into poison. Yasuke, coughing, his eyes red from the smoke, looked to Ranmabu. The young page was down, struck by a stray arrow, the life fading from his eyes amidst the inferno. Yasuke let out a roar, a sound of pure, primal grief and fury that rose above the crackling of the fire. He was alone now. The dream of the Black Lord, the castle, the new life, it was all burning in the fires of Honnoju. But he was still breathing. He was still a samurai. He turned from the inner sanctum, the flames licking at his heels. He could not save his lord, but he could still serve the clan. Nobutada the heir was at Nijo Castle, a short distance away. If the lineage was to survive, the son must live. Yasuke charged through the burning courtyard. The Akechi soldiers, seeing the giant emerge from the wall of fire like a demon, born of the inferno, scrambled back in terror. His armor was scorched, his sword stained dark, his face a mask of soot and determination. He did not run from the fight. He ran toward the next one. He cut a path through the encirclement, his blade rising and falling with mechanical precision. He was an ox, a battering ram, smashing through the line of pikemen who tried to bar his way. He vaulted over the burning debris of the gate, landing heavy on the street outside. The city was in panic. Smoke rose in a black pillar, marking the grave of the era. Yasuke did not look back. He ran through the streets of Kyoto, his breath tearing at his lungs, his heart hammering against his ribs like a war drum. He ran toward Nijo Castle, toward the air, toward the last stand. The rain had stopped hours ago, but now a different kind of storm washed over the capital, a storm of blood and ash. And running through the center of it, a solitary figure of obsidian and iron, the last Moil giant, marching toward a destiny that would swallow him into the mists of legend. He reached the gates of Nijo Castle just as the sun fully crested the eastern mountains, illuminating the destruction. The guards at Nijo, seeing the black samurai approach, covered in soot and blood, threw open the gates. They knew him. They knew that if Yasuke was here and Nobunaga was not, the world had broken. He entered the courtyard of the second castle, his chest heaving. The heir, Oda Nobunaga, was already rallying his defenses, having seen the smoke from the temple. He looked at Yasuke, and no words were needed. The look in the giant's eyes told the story of the fire, the betrayal, and the end of the Demon King. "My lord," Yasuke gasped, bowing low, his voice raspy from the smoke. "The temple is lost. Lord Nobunaga is gone." Nobutada gripped his sword, his knuckles white. "Then we fight," the heir said. "We fight until the end." Yasuke straightened, rising to his full, imposing height. He tightened his grip on his sword hilt. The fatigue that screamed in his muscles was pushed down, buried under the iron will of his discipline. He took his place beside the heir. The Akechi forces were already swarming toward Nijo, a sea of blue seeking to drown the last remnants of the Oda line. This was the final march. There was no retreat, no other castle to run to. The walls of Nijo were strong, but the enemy was legion. Yasuke looked at the approaching army, thousands of men against a handful of defenders. He felt a strange calm settle over him. He was a long way from the red earth of Mozambique, a long way from the Jesuit ships, a long way from the first days of staring crowds. He was a samurai of Japan, and he would die as one. The first arrows whistled over the walls of Nijo, signaling the beginning of the end. Yasuke exhaled slowly, watching the flight of the shafts against the morning sky, and prepared to meet the wave. The last march was over. The final stand had begun. The arrow struck the timber beam beside his head with a dull, vibrating thud, the feathered shaft quivering like a trapped bird. It was the first note in a symphony of destruction that was about to descend upon Nijo Castle. Yasuke did not flinch. His eyes, dark and unreadable, remained fixed on the horizon where the blue banners of the Akechi clan fluttered like tempestuous waves against the morning sky. The air, previously cool and still with the lingering dampness of dawn, began to thicken with the copper scent of blood and the sulphurous bite of black powder. He stood at the threshold of the inner gate, a towering figure clad in the lacquered armor that had been a gift from the man who was now ash. The weight of the plating felt familiar, a second skin that bound him to this land, to this code, and to the doom that was rapidly approaching. Around him, the retainers of Oda Nobunaga moved with the frantic, focused energy of men who knew they were already ghosts. There was no panic, only a grim, steely resolve to sell their lives dearly, to buy time for a spirit to depart this world with honor. Yasuke gripped the hilt of his sword, the shark skin wrapping rough against his palm. It was a long blade, forged for his immense reach, a weapon that had cleaved through the doubts of a nation and earned him a place at the right hand of a demon king. Now, it would serve the sun. He looked at Nobutada, the young heir, whose face was pale but composed. The prince was the reflection of his father, possessing that same piercing gaze, that same refusal to bend before the inevitable. They exchanged a single glance, a silent communication that transcended language and station. In that look there was an acknowledgment of the end and a mutual pact to meet it standing. The roar of the Akechi army grew louder, a cacophony of shouting men, stampeding horses, and the rhythmic clatter of armor. They were thousands strong, a sea of enemies crashing against the stone breakwater of the castle walls. The first wave hit the gates with the force of a landslide. Wood splintered, iron groaned, and the air was filled with the sharp cracks of arquebus fire. Smoke began to drift across the courtyard, white and ghost-like, obscuring the violence that erupted at the perimeter. Yasuke moved. He did not run. He flowed, a massive stone gathered by gravity, descending into the fray. When he stepped into the courtyard, a strange ripple went through the front lines of the attacking soldiers. Even in the heat of the assault, even with the bloodlust high in their veins, they paused. The sight of him, the obsidian samurai, the giant from the far seas, the man who possessed the strength of 10 struck a primal chord of fear in their hearts. He towered over them, a silhouette of darkness against the rising smoke, his helmet casting a shadow over eyes that burned with a quiet, intense fire. For a heartbeat, the battle held its breath. Then, with a roar that seemed to rise from the earth itself, Yasuke shattered the stillness. He drew his blade, the steel singing a high, clear note, and surged forward. The combat that followed was not a duel, it was a force of nature. Yasuke fought with a style that blended the disciplined fluidity of the samurai arts with the raw, overpowering kineticism of his own heritage. He was a storm in human form. His blade flashed, a streak of lightning in the gloom, and men fell before him like dry wheat before a scythe. He did not just parry, he crushed. He did not just strike, he obliterated. The Akechi soldiers, emboldened by their numbers, swarmed him, thrusting their spears and slashing their katanas. But he moved with a deceptive grace, pivoting and striking with a precision that belied his size. One soldier, his face twisted in a mask of terror and aggression, lunged with a spear. Yasuke stepped the thrust by a mere inch, the wood grazing his breastplate, and with a fluid motion of his hips brought the pommel of his sword down upon the man's helmet. The soldier crumpled without a sound. Another attacked from the flank, but Yasuke was already turning, his blade sweeping in a wide, deadly arc that forced 3 men to scramble backward, tripping over their own feet to escape his reach. He fought not with the frenzied desperation of a trapped animal, but with the focused, rhythmic breathing of a master at work. In his mind, the noise of the battle, the screams, the clashes, the thunder of muskets faded into a distant hum. He was centered. He was present. He was enacting the final duty of a vassal. Every swing of his sword was a tribute to Nobunaga. Every drop of sweat a libation to the memory of the conversations they had shared in the tea rooms of Azuchi, where the warlord had looked past his skin and seen his soul. But for every enemy he cut down, 2 more took their place. The Akechi forces were inexorable, a tide that could not be turned back by a single rock, no matter how unyielding. The walls of Nijo were breached. The outer defences collapsed, and the enemy poured into the inner sanctum, their blue banners staining the courtyard like spreading ink. Behind him, the great hall of the castle began to glow with an ominous orange light. The enemy had loosed fire arrows, and the dry timber of the ancient structure was hungry for the flame. The heat intensified, pressing against Yasuke's back, a physical weight that rivaled his armor. The smell of burning pine and cedar mixed with the metallic tang of blood, creating a perfume of destruction that stung the eyes and throat. Yasuke fell back, step by bloody step, retreating toward the inner chambers where Nobunaga waited. He was the gatekeeper now, the last line of defense between the heir and the humiliation of capture. His breath came in heavy, heaving rasps, his muscles burning with the lactic acid of exertion. But his arm did not falter. He stood at the entrance to the main hall. The sliding doors opened behind him, framing the inferno that was beginning to consume the ceiling. Inside, Oda Nobunaga sat on the tatami mats. The young lord had prepared himself. He had shed his heavy armor, wearing only the white robes of death. Around him, his closest retainers were doing the same, preparing for the final journey. They did not look at the battle raging outside. Their focus was inward, on the purity of the moment. Nobunaga looked up, his eyes meeting Yasuke's through the smoke. There was a nod, a release. The prince was signaling that the time for fighting was done, that the time for dying had arrived. But Yasuke could not join them in this ritual. He was a samurai, yes, but he was also something else. He was a man of the mission, a man of the church, a man whose path to the afterlife was paved with different prayers. He would not slit his belly. He would fight until the breath left his body, or until the enemy overwhelmed him. He turned his back on the seppuku ceremony, facing the horde of soldiers rushing up the wooden steps. The fire roared louder now, the cracking of timber sounding like the breaking of bones. Sparks showered down like golden rain, catching on Yasuke's armor, hissing against the damp sweat of his neck. The Akechi soldiers hesitated at the bottom of the steps, looking up at the demon who guarded the burning temple. He stood framed by the fire, a silhouette of defiance, his sword held low, dripping with crimson. "Come," he whispered, the word lost in the roar of the flames, but the intent clear in his stance. They charged. This time they did not come one by one. They came as a wall of steel. Yasuke met them with a roar that shook the burning beams above. He fought with the strength of a man who has nothing left to lose. He shattered blades. He broke formations. He threw men bodily down the stairs. For a few glorious, impossible minutes he held the door. He bought Nobunaga the silence he needed. He bought the Oda clan their dignity. But the sheer weight of numbers was undeniable. A spear struck his shoulder, piercing the gaps in his armor. A sword slashed across his thigh. He stumbled, the pain sharp and bright, but he did not fall. He swung his blade, clearing a space around him, but he was slowing down. The blood loss was taking its toll. The edges of his vision began to blur, the world narrowing to a tunnel of fire and steel. The soldiers, sensing his weakening, emboldened, They surrounded him, wary of his reach, circling like wolves around a wounded buffalo. They realized that to kill him was difficult, perhaps too costly. Instead, they sought to bind him. Ropes were thrown, nets cast. Yasuke slashed at them, severing the fibers, but they came from all sides. A heavy blow from the flat of a spear struck the back of his helmet, sending a shockwave through his skull. The world tilted. His knees hit the wooden floorboards. The heat of the fire was unbearable now, singeing his skin. He tried to rise, to lift the sword that had become too heavy, but hands were upon him. Dozens of hands. They grabbed his arms, his legs, his neck. They bore him down under their collective weight, pressing his face against the floor. He struggled, his muscles coiling and snapping, throwing men off, but more piled on. The strength of 10 men was finally subdued by the strength of 100. He lay pinned, breathing hard against the wood, the sounds of the fire consuming the castle filling his ears. He could feel the vibrations of the building groaning in its death throes. Behind him, deeper in the hall, the silence was absolute. Nobutada was gone. The duty was fulfilled. Yasuke was dragged from the burning building, his armor scraping against the ground, his sword stripped from his hand. They hauled him out into the courtyard, away from the collapsing structure, into the cool grey light of the day that felt miles away from the hell he had just inhabited. He was bound with thick ropes, his arms twisted behind his back, forced to his knees in the dirt. The soldiers stood around him, chests heaving, staring at their prize with a mixture of awe and confusion. They had expected a monster. They had found a warrior. They poked at him with their spear tips, wary, as if he might explode back into violence at any moment. But Yasuke remained still. He bowed his head, his breathing slowing, his heart hammering a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. He waited for the blade. He waited for the execute order that would send him to join his lord. But the order did not come. Instead, the ranks of the soldiers parted. A hush fell over the courtyard. Quieter than the roar of the fire, a figure approached, riding a horse with the grace of a conqueror. It was Akechi Mitsuhide, the traitor. The man who had turned the world upside down. Mitsuhide looked down at the captive giant. His face was a mask of cold calculation, his eyes searching Yasuke's form. He saw the blood, the battered armor, the defiant set of the shoulders. He saw the undeniable nobility of the man who had fought for a dead lord while his own biological kin had fled or turned. Yasuke looked up. He did not beg. He did not speak. He met the traitor's gaze with the same intensity he had shown Nobunaga. In that moment, 2 worlds collided. The rigid insular world of the traditional samurai and the expanding complex world that Yasuke represented. Mitsuhide frowned. He gestured with his war fan, a dismissive, almost contemptuous flick of the wrist. When he spoke, his voice was dry, carrying across the silent courtyard. "The black man is a beast," Mitsuhide declared, his words calculated to strip Yasuke of his status, to deny him the death of a samurai. "He knows nothing, he is not Japanese, therefore do not kill him." The words hung in the air, heavy and cruel. To a samurai, to be spared because one was considered unworthy of death was a fate worse than execution. It was an erasure. It was a declaration that his service, his loyalty, his fighting spirit meant nothing because of his origin. Mitsuhide was not saving him out of mercy. He was discarding him like a broken tool. "Take him to the Nanban-dera," Mitsuhide commanded, turning his horse away. "Let the priests deal with their own." The soldiers hauled Yasuke to his feet. He did not struggle. The fight had left him, replaced by a hollow, aching numbness. The insult burned deeper than the physical wounds, deeper than the fire that was now consuming the last of the Oda legacy behind him. He was being returned to the world he had left behind, the world of the Jesuits, the world of the observer, stripped of the sword that had made him a participant. They marched him through the streets of Kyoto. The city was in chaos. smoke rising from multiple districts, citizens fleeing with their belongings on their backs. But as the group of soldiers escorting the giant black warrior passed, people stopped. They stared, just as they had stared 2 years ago when he had first arrived. But the wonder was gone, replaced by fear and pity. The giant who had ridden beside the demon king was now a prisoner, bound and bloodied, a fallen titan walking amongst the ruins of an era. The walk to the Nambandera, the Jesuit church, felt like a funeral procession for a life that had been brief but blindingly bright. Every step took him further away from the identity of Yasuke the samurai and back toward the identity of the stranger from Mozambique. He looked at his hands, bound with rough hemp, hands that had held the cup of sake poured by Nobunaga, hands that had held the fan of a lord, hands that had wielded the steel of Japan. They reached the gates of the church. The Jesuit fathers were there, anxious and pale, watching the war unfold from their sanctuary. They saw the soldiers approaching, saw the massive figure in their midst. Recognition dawned on their faces. It was the man Valignano had brought, the man they had lost to the warlord's court. The Akehi captain shoved Yasuke forward. "Here," he grunted. "This is yours. Lord Akechi has no use for beasts." The captain turned and marched his men away, back to the war, back to the history books that would record their names and deeds. Yasuke stood alone at the threshold of the church. The ropes were cut. He rubbed his wrists, the sensation returning slowly. He looked back one last time toward the center of the city. The smoke from Nijo Castle was a dark pillar holding up the sky. Nobunaga was gone. Nobutada was gone. The dream of a unified Japan under the Oda banner had vanished in a night of fire and treachery. Yasuke stepped through the gates of the Nambandera. The heavy wooden doors began to close, shutting out the sights and sounds of the burning capital. The light of the afternoon sun narrowed to a sliver, then was extinguished as the latch clicked into place. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of incense and wax, a stark contrast to the blood and smoke of the world outside. The silence of the sanctuary wrapped around him, heavy and final. He walked into the shadows of the nave, his footsteps echoing on the stone floor. History tells us that Akechi Mitsuhide would fall only days later, defeated by Toyotomi Hideyoshi, who would avenge his lord and eventually unify the nation. But of the man known as Yasuke, the chronicle ends here. The ink runs dry, the paper fades. He had walked out of the mists of the Indian Ocean into the fiery heart of feudal Japan, risen to the highest peaks of honor, and fought in the most pivotal battles of the age. And now, as the doors of the church sealed him away from the eyes of the chroniclers, he stepped back into the mist. Some say he returned to the missions, living out his days in quiet service. Others whisper that he found a way back to the sea, seeking the long voyage home to the red earth of his birth. And there are those who believe that the warrior spirit never truly left, that he wandered the mountains of Japan, a ronin with no master, a legend whispered in rural villages, a giant shadow protecting the weak. But as the candle flames flickered on the altar of the Nambandera, casting long, dancing shadows against the walls, Yasuke, the obsidian samurai, closed his eyes. The fire of the temple still burned in his memory, but the long sleep of history was beginning to settle over him. The path of the warrior had ended. The path of the legend had begun. The silence of the church deepened, absorbing the last echoes of the Sengoku period, holding the secret of his fate in its eternal, quiet embrace. The heavy wooden doors of the Nambandera did not merely shut out the chaotic smoke of the burning capital, they seemed to seal away time itself. Within the dim sanctuary of the Jesuit mission, the air hung suspended, thick with the scent of foreign beeswax and the lingering metallic tang of a battle that was already becoming a memory. Yasuke sat in the shadows, the adrenaline of the Hono-ji incident slowly receding like a tide pulling back from a rocky shore, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt heavy against the skin. This was the gate of silence. It was not a physical structure of iron or wood, but a threshold between the life of the sword and the life of the spirit. between the man who walked the earth and the legend that would drift into the mist. As he rested his back against the cool plaster of the wall, his breath steadying into a slow, rhythmic cadence, the boundaries of the room began to dissolve. The stone floor beneath him, cold and solid, felt less like the foundation of a church, and more like the deck of a great ship swaying gently on the currents of history. His mind, unmoored from the immediate danger of the rebellion, began to drift backward, flowing against the stream of time. Before he was a samurai, before he was a retainer, before he was the curiosity of Kyoto, he was a man of the earth and the sea. The darkness of the church became the darkness of a vast ocean at night, the kind of darkness that swaddled the world before the invention of maps. He remembered the red earth. It was a vivid, iron-rich dust that clung to the skin, a memory of Mozambique that lived in the soles of his feet. In the quiet of the Kyoto night, he could almost hear the wind moving through the baobab trees, a sound distinct from the rustling of the Japanese bamboo. It was a deeper, lower hum, the voice of a land ancient and sun-drenched. He recalled the Makua people, the rhythms of their speech, the strength drawn from a landscape that demanded resilience. He had carried that strength across oceans, a hidden cargo within his own heart. The journey returned to him now in fragments, floating in the silence. The creaking of the Portuguese rigging, the endless expanse of the Indian Ocean, the smell of salt and wet canvas. He remembered the transition from the familiar warmth of Africa to the humid, complex air of India, and finally to the sharp, pine-scented winds of Japan. He had arrived as a protector, a shadow to the Jesuit visitor Alessandro Valignano, towering over the crowds that gathered at the docks. In the stillness of his sanctuary, Yasuke replayed the sensation of those early days, the crushing weight of eyes, thousands of eyes. He remembered the riot in Kyoto, the way the people had climbed atop roofs just to catch a glimpse of him, their curiosity of physical force that pressed against the walls of the Jesuit residence. It had been a time of noise, of overwhelming, chaotic sound. Yet in this final reflection, the noise was muffled. What remained was the feeling of standing apart, a mountain amidst a sea of moving waves. And then the memory shifted to the moment that changed the trajectory of his soul, the summons of the great castle, the presence of Oda Nobunaga. In the dark, Yasuke's hand instinctively brushed his side, searching for the phantom weight of the saimaki, the ceremonial sword he had been granted. It was gone now, but the feeling of the hilt remained imprinted on his palm. He thought of the warlord not as the demon king feared by his enemies, but as the intensely curious man who had looked at him and seen not a beast, but a marvel. The scrapping incident, so famous in the whispers of the court, played out in his mind with a slow, gentle clarity. He remembered the rough texture of the cloth, the cool water sluicing over his skin, and the intent gaze of Nobunaga. When the skin did not lighten, when the water ran clear, the silence that had fallen over the courtyard was the first opening of the gate. It was the silence of understanding. Nobunaga had recognized a strength that mirrored his own strength, that defied the natural order of the world he knew. In that moment of recognition, the distance between the Makua warrior and the Japanese daimyo had vanished. They were two men standing on the precipice of a changing world. Nobunaga, who sought to unify the fractured shards of Japan under one banner, and Yasuke, who had crossed the fractured shards of the globe to stand there. They were both anomalies, giants in their own regard, bound by a mutual respect that transcended language. The memory deepened, moving from the visual to the auditory. Yasuke could hear the murmur of Nobunaga's voice late at night, the clinking of tea bowls, the rustle of silk. He had learned the language of this archipelago, the soft vowels and the clicked consonants, allowing him to weave his own story into the tapestry of the Oda clan. He remembered the pride of being named a kosho, a bearer of weapons, a trusted confidant. It was a rise so meteoric it felt like a dream, to sit at the table of the most powerful man in the realm, to walk the corridors of Azuchi Castle, not as a servant, but as a samurai. He thought of the armor they had fashioned for him, black lacquer that drank the light, plates of steel laced together with silk cords that strained against his broad shoulders. When he wore it, he felt the transformation complete. He was no longer just a man from a faraway land. He was a piece of the night itself, given form and purpose. The strength of 10 men, the chronicles would say. But sitting in the church, Yasuke knew his strength was not just in the muscle of his arm, but in the fluidity of his spirit. He had been water, taking the shape of the vessel he was poured into, yet never losing his essence. The fire of Hono-ji flickered again in the back of his mind, but it was distant now, like a bonfire seen from a mountaintop. The betrayal, the shouting, the clash of steel, it was fading. He had fought. He had stood his ground when the world collapsed. He had defended the heir, Nobunaga, with a loyalty that burned brighter than the temple flames. And he had survived. That survival was the greatest mystery of all. Why had the sword of the enemy stopped? The black man is a beast and knows nothing. Do not kill him. The words of Mitsuhide, meant as an insult, meant to strip him of his warrior status, had instead become the key to his freedom. By denying him the death of a samurai, they had inadvertently granted him the life of a legend. They had released him from the rigid cycle of vengeance and death, pushing him through the gate of silence and into the unknown. The church was quiet. The rain outside had settled into a steady, soothing drumming against the roof, a sound that mimicked the heartbeat of the earth. Yasuke closed his eyes fully now, the tension in his shoulders released, plate by plate, muscle by muscle. Where would he go from here? The history books would close their pages, the scribes would lay down their brushes, the ink would dry. To the chroniclers he would vanish. But in the theatre of the mind, the journey was far from over. Perhaps he would return to the sea. He could see the path clearly walking away from the capital, shedding the armor that had defined him. Wearing simple robes that blended with the soil, he would walk toward the coast, guided by the smell of salt. He would find a ship, perhaps one of the great carracks bound for Goa or Malacca. He would stand on the deck as the islands of Japan receded into the mist, a green jewel sinking into the grey ocean. He would watch the pole star dip lower in the sky as he sailed south, returning to the warmth, returning to the red earth. Or perhaps he would stay. The mountains of Japan were vast and deep, filled with hidden valleys and forests where the cedar trees grew so thick they blocked out the sun. He could disappear there, becoming a ronin, a wave man. He might wander from village to village, a towering figure in the twilight, helping a farmer lift a fallen cart, protecting a traveller from bandits, and then vanishing before thanks could be given. He would become a local god, a spirit of the woods, the dark guardian who appears in the rain. The possibilities swirled around him like smoke, soft and intangible. It did not matter which path the physical man took, for the spirit had already achieved something immortal. He had proved that a man could be more than his origins, more than the station of his birth. He had bridged 2 worlds that were never meant to touch. The darkness of the church felt protective now, a warm blanket pulled up against the chill of history. The sensation of his own body began to feel light, as if he were turning into mist, ready to drift out through the cracks in the walls, out into the night air. The pain of the battles, the fatigue of the journeys, the grief for his fallen lord, all of it softened, smoothed over by the passage of time. He breathed in the scent of the rain-soaked wood. He breathed out the smoke of the Sengoku period. The era of warring states was a time of fire and blood, but Yasuke was of the earth and the water. The fire had burned itself out, but the earth remained. The water remained. He was the obsidian samurai, but he was also the child of the savannah, the voyager of the Indian Ocean, the silent observer of history's turning wheel. As the night deepened, the candlelight on the altar finally sputtered and died, plunging the room into absolute velvet darkness. But there was no fear in this dark. It was the same darkness that held the stars. It was the same darkness that held the deep roots of the trees. It was a darkness of rest. Yasuke let go. He let go of the sword. He let go of the title. He let go of the name given to him by others. He returned to the silence from which he came, a silence not of emptiness, but of fullness, a silence containing all the words that were never written, all the deeds that were never recorded. The mist rose from the ground outside, wrapping the temple in a white embrace. The city of Kyoto slept, unaware that one of its greatest legends was slipping away, dissolving into the very atmosphere of the country. He would be in the shadow of the mountains. He would be in the depth of the lacquerware. He would be in the strength of the iron. The gate of silence closed gently behind him, the latch clicking shut with a sound no louder than a falling leaf. The story was done. The warrior could rest. The currents of time slowed, the river widening as it reached the sea, the waters becoming calm, flat, and glassy. There is a peace in being forgotten by history, for it means you belong only to yourself and to the quiet earth. The heavy breathing of the world slowed down, matching the rhythm of the falling rain. The past is a dream, and the future is a distant shore, and here, in the space between, there is only the soft, enveloping comfort of the now. Drifting, floating. The great ship of his life had come into harbour. The sails were furled. The anchor was dropped into the soft sand of the seabed. The water was still. Yasuke, the warrior of two worlds, faded into the tapestry of the night, becoming one with the shadows, one with the silence, one with the sleep that claims us all. Good night.